Hello. I'm gonna continue on, I suppose, from where I left off the other day. I might give it a couple minutes or two to see if anyone fills in. There seems to be one concurrent viewer according to the YouTube backend. I can guarantee it's either Lady of Charlotte or Not Sure. It'll be one of those two. I will say, in the meantime, between Thursday of last week and today, however, there has been quite the development, I should say. I had a number of people from, or shall I say, a couple of people from the Mises Institute and those affiliated with it who gave me some rather generous donations over the last couple of days and has pushed where I'm just now to £814 of a total goal of £1,100, which I'm not really sure how long that's then still going to take to finish it off, but I don't know. We shall see. But for anyone who's not aware of what's going on, I'm doing a reading of Human Action and sort of live segments to go hand in hand with this fundraiser here that I'm running, so that I can make it to the Mises Institute later on this year, as things maybe aren't quite the best money wise in certain situations. And given other things to do with my association with universities and this, that, and the next thing, it's probably something I will not get an opportunity to do again. So if you would like to help me in taking this opportunity in July of this year, that would be greatly appreciated. And you can find a link pinned in the chat and also in the description. I don't think there is too much else to say other than, well, I'm in the wrong place now and I've gone and done something silly. That's what I want. Another good news, I finally managed to get my hands on my passport today, which has been reported time and time again in media as the next big supply chain backlog, is that people can't get their passports, and it's probably all just an inkling at the end of the day towards 1,000,006 other reasons why we should replace physical passports with digital passports. But give me 2 seconds. Right. Yeah, I suppose I should crack on from where I left off. Praxeology and liberalism. Liberalism is a political doctrine. It is not a theory, but an application of the theories developed by praxeology and especially by economics to definite problems of human action within society. As a political doctrine, liberalism is not neutral with regard to values and the ultimate ends sought by action. It assumes that all men, or at least the majority of people, are intent upon attaining certain goals. It gives them information about the means suitable to the realization of their plans. The champions of liberal doctrines are fully aware of the fact that their teachings are valid only for people who are committed to these valuational principles. While praxeology, and therefore economics too, uses the term happiness and removal of uneasiness in a purely formal sense, liberalism attaches to them a concrete meaning. It presupposes that people prefer life to death, health to sickness, nourishment to starvation, abundance to poverty. It teaches man how to act in accordance with these valuations. It is customary to call these concerns materialistic and to charge liberalism with an alleged crude materialism and a neglect of the higher and nobler pursuits of mankind. Man does not live by bread alone, say the critics, and they disparage the meanness and despicable baseness of the utilitarian philosophy. However, these passionate diatribes are wrong because they badly distort the teaching of liberalism. First, the liberals do not assert that men ought to strive after the goals mentioned above. What they maintain is that the immense majority prefer a life of health and abundance to misery, starvation, and death. The correctness of this statement cannot be challenged. It is proved by the fact that all anti-liberal doctrines, the theocratic tenets of the various religious, statist, nationalist, and socialist parties, adopt the same attitude with regard to these issues. They all promise their followers a life plenty. They have never ventured to tell people that the realization of their program will impair their material well-being. They insist, on the contrary, that while the realization of the plans of their rival parties will result in indignance for the majority, they themselves want to provide their supporters with abundance. The Christian parties are no less eager in promising the masses a higher standard of living than the nationalists and the socialists. Present-day churches often speak more about raising wage rates and farm incomes than about the dogmas of the Christian doctrine. Secondly, the liberals do not disdain the intellectual and spiritual aspirations of man. On the contrary, they are promoted by a passionate ardor for intellectual and moral perfection, for wisdom and for aesthetic excellence. But their view of these high and noble things is far from the crude representations of their adversaries. They do not share the naive opinion that any system of social organisation can directly succeed in encouraging philosophical or scientific thinking, in producing masterpieces of art and literature, and in rendering the masses more enlightened. They realise that all that society can achieve in these fields is to provide an environment which does not put insurmountable obstacles in the way of genius and makes the common man free enough for material concerns to become interested in things other than mere breadwinning. In their opinion, the foremost social means of making man more human is to fight poverty. Wisdom and science and the arts thrive better in a world of affluence than among needy peoples. Oh, sorry, a bit clagged up. I'm sure that'll smooth out as I carry on. It is a purposeful distortion of facts to blame the age of liberalism for an alleged materialism. The 19th century was not only a century of unprecedented improvement in technical methods of production and the material well-being of the masses, it did much more than extend the average length of human life. Its scientific and artistic accomplishments are imperishable. It was an age of immortal musicians, writers, poets, painters, and sculptors. It revolutionized philosophy, economics, mathematics, physics, chemistry, and biology, and, for the first time in history, it made the great works and the great thoughts accessible to the common man. I'll start that new heading in a second. I just need to grab something. Oh. No, I need to grab a cushion, otherwise I just slouch in this bloody chair. And that's not good if you're going to be sitting here for 4 hours. Liberalism and religion. Liberalism is based upon a purely rational and scientific theory of social cooperation. The policies it recommends are the application of a system of knowledge which does not refer in any way to sentiments, intuitive creeds for which no logically sufficient proof can be provided, mystical experiences, and the personal awareness of superhuman phenomena. In this sense, the often misunderstood and erroneously interpreted epithets atheistic and agnostic cannot be attributed to it. It would, however, be a serious mistake to conclude that the sciences of human action and the policy derived from their teachings, liberalism, are anti-theistic and hostile to religion. They are radically opposed to all systems of theocracy, but they are entirely neutral with regard to religious beliefs which do not pretend to interfere with the conduct of social, political, and economic affairs. Theocracy is a social system which lays claim to a superhuman title for its legitimation. The fundamental law of a theocratic regime is an insight not open to examination by reason and to demonstration by logical methods. Its ultimate standard is intuition, providing the mind with subjective certainty about things which cannot be conceived by reason and ratiocination. If this intuition refers to one of the traditional systems of teachings concerning the existence of a divine creator and ruler of the universe, we call it a religious belief. If it refers to another system, we call it a metaphysical belief. Thus, a system of theocratic government need not be founded on one of the great historical religions of the world. It may be the outcome of metaphysical tenets which reject all traditional churches and denominations and take pride in emphasizing their anti-theistic and anti-metaphysical character. In our time, the most powerful theocratic parties are opposed to Christianity and to all other religions which evolved from Jewish monotheism. What characterizes them as theocratic is their craving to organize the earthly affairs of mankind according to the contents of a complex of ideas whose validity cannot be demonstrated by reasoning. They pretend that their leaders are blessed by a knowledge inaccessible to the rest of mankind, and contrary to the ideas maintained by those to whom the charisma is denied. The charismatic leaders have been entrusted by a mystical higher power with the office of managing the affairs of erring mankind. They alone are enlightened. All other people are either blind and deaf or malefactors. It is a fact that many varieties of the great historical religions were affected by theocratic tendencies. Their apostles were inspired by a craving for power and the oppression and annihilation of all dissenting groups. However, we must not confuse the two things, religion and theocracy. William James calls religious the feeling, acts, and experiences of individual men in their solitude so far as they apprehend themselves to stand in relation to whatever they may consider the divine. He enumerates the following beliefs as the characteristics of the religious life. The visible world is part of a more spiritual universe from which it draws. Its chief significance, that union or harmonious relationship with the higher universe, is our true end. That prayer or inner communion with the spirit thereof, be that spirit of God or law, is a process wherein work is really done and spiritual energy flows in and produces effects, psychological or material, within the phenomenal world. Religion, James goes on to say, also includes the following psychological characteristics: a new zest which adds itself like a gift to life and takes that form either of lyrical enchantment or of appeal to earnestness and heroism, and furthermore an assurance of safety and a temper of peace, and, in relation to others, a preponderance of loving affection. This characterization of mankind's religious experience and feeling does not make any reference to the arrangement of social cooperation. Religion, as James sees it, is a purely personal and individual relation between man and a wholly mysterious and awe-inspiring divine reality. It enjoins upon man a certain mode of individual conduct, but it does not assert anything with regard to the problems of social organization. St. Francis de Assisi, the greatest religious genius of the West, did not concern himself with politics and economics. He wanted to teach his disciples how to live piously. He did not draft a plan for the organization of production, and did not urge his followers to resort to violence against dissenters. He is not responsible for the interpretation of his teachings by the order he founded. Liberalism puts no obstacles in the way of a man eager to adjust his personal conduct and his private affairs according to the mode which he individually or his church or denomination interpret the teachings of the Gospels. But it is radically opposed to all endeavours to silence a rational discussion of problems of social welfare by an appeal to religious intuition and revelation. It does not enjoin divorce or the practice of birth control upon anybody, but it fights those who want to prevent other people from freely discussing the pros and cons of these matters. In the liberal opinion, the aim of the moral law is to impel individuals to adjust their conduct to the requirements of life and society, to abstain from all acts detrimental to the preservation of peaceful social cooperation and to the improvement of interhuman relations. They welcome the support which religious teachings may give to those moral precepts of which they themselves approve, but they are opposed to all norms which are bound to bring about social disintegration from whatever source they may stem. It is a distortion of fact to say, as many champions of religious theocracy do, that liberalism fights religion. Where the principle of church interference with secular issues is in force, the various churches, denominations, and sects are fighting one another. By separating church and state, liberalism establishes peace between the various religious factions and gives to each of them the opportunity to preach its gospel unmolested. Liberalism is rationalistic. It maintains that it is possible to convince the immense majority that peaceful cooperation within the framework of society better serves their rightly understood interests than mutual battling and social disintegration. It has full confidence in man's reason. It may be that this optimism is unfounded and that the liberals have erred, but then there is no hope left for mankind's future. Hello friends in chat. You're joining me along for the ride. Number 3, the division of labour. The fundamental social phenomenon is the division of labour, and its counterpart, human cooperation. Experience teaches man that cooperative action is more efficient and productive than isolated action of self-sufficient individuals. The natural conditions determining man's life and effort are such that the division of labour increases output per unit of labour expended. These natural facts are, first, the innate inequality of men with regard to their ability to perform various kinds of labour. Second, the unequal distribution of the nature-given non-human opportunities of production on the surface of the earth. One may as well consider these two facts as one and the same fact, namely, the manifoldness of nature which makes the universe a complex of infinite varieties. If the Earth's surface were such that the physical conditions of production were the same at every point, and if one man was equal to all other men, as is a circle to another with the same diameter in Euclidean geometry, division of labour would not offer any advantage for acting man. There is still a third fact, vis-a-vis that there are undertakings whose accomplishment exceeds the forces of a single man and requires the joint effort of several. Some of them require an expenditure of labour which no single man can perform because his capacity to work is not great enough. Others could be accomplished by individuals, but the time which they would have to devote to the work would be so long that the result would only be attained late. It would not compensate for the labour expended. In both cases, only joint effort makes it possible to attain the end sought. If only this third condition were present, temporary cooperation between man would have certainly emerged. However, such transient alliances to cope with specific tasks which are beyond the strength of an individual would not have brought about lasting social cooperation. Undertakings which could be formed only in this way were not very numerous at the early stages of civilization. Moreover, all those concerned may not often agree that the performance in question is more useful and urgent than the accomplishment of other tasks which they could perform alone. The great human society enclosing all men in all of their activities did not originate from such occasional alliances. Society is much more than a passing alliance concluded for a definite purpose and ceasing as soon as its objective is realised. Even if the partners are ready to renew, it should on an occasion present itself. The increase in productivity brought about by the division of labour is obvious whenever the inequality of their participants is such that every individual or every piece of land is superior to at least in one regard to the other individuals or pieces of land concerned. If A is fit to produce in 1 unit of time 6p or 4q, and B only 2p but 8q, they both, when working in isolation, will produce together 4p plus 6q. When working under the division of labour, each of them producing only that commodity in whose production he is more efficient than his partner, they will produce 6p plus 8q. But what will happen if A is more efficient than B, and not only in the production of P, but also in the production of Q? This is the problem which Ricardo raised and solved immediately. Section 4. The Ricardian Law of Association. Ricardo expounded upon the law of association in order to demonstrate what the consequences of division of labour are when an individual or a group, more efficient in every regard, cooperates with an individual or a group less efficient in every regard. He investigated the effects of trade between two areas, unequally endowed by nature, under the assumption that the products but not the workers and the accumulated factors of future production, capital goods, can freely move from each area into the other. The division of labour between two areas will, as Ricardo's law shows, increase the productivity of labour, and is therefore advantageous to all concerned, even if the physical conditions of production for any commodity are more favourable in one or two of these areas than in the other. It is advantageous for the better endowed area to concentrate its efforts upon the production of those commodities for which its superiority is greater, and to leave to the less endowed area the production of other goods in which its own superiority is less. The paradox that it is more advantageous to leave more favourable domestic conditions of production unused and to procure the commodities they could produce from areas in which conditions for their production are less favourable is the outcome of the immobility of labour and capital, to which the more favourable places of production are inaccessible. Ricardo was fully aware of the fact that his law of comparative cost, which he expounded mainly in order to deal with a special problem of international trade, is a particular instance of the more universal law of association. If A is in such a way more efficient than B, then he needs for the production of 1 unit of the commodity P 3 hours compared with, or P 3 hours compared with B's 5, and for the production of 1 unit of Q 2 hours compared with B's 4. Then both will gain if A confines himself to producing Q and leaves B to produce P. If each of them gives 60 hours to producing P and 60 hours to producing Q, the result of A's labour is 20P plus 30Q, of B's 12B plus 15Q, and for both together 32P plus 45Q. If, however, A confines himself to producing Q alone, he produces 60Q in 120 hours, while B, if he confines himself to producing P, produces in the same time 24P. The result of their activities is then 24P plus 60Q, which, as Q has for a substitution ratio of 3 over 2Q, and for B, 5 over 4Q, signifies a larger output than 32P plus 45Q. Therefore, it is manifest that the division of labour brings advantages to all who take part in it. Collaboration of the more talented, more able, and more industrious with the less talented, less able, and less industrious results in benefit for both. The gains derived from the division of labour are always mutual. The law of association makes us comprehend the tendencies which resulted in the progressive intensification of the progressive intensification of human cooperation. We conceive what incentive induced people not to consider themselves simply as rivals in a struggle for the appropriation of the limited supply of means of subsistence made available by nature. We realize what has impelled them and permanently impels them to consort with one another for the sake of cooperation. Every step forward on the way to develop a mode of division of labour serves the interests of all participants. In order to comprehend why man did not remain solitary, searching like the animals for food and shelter for himself, only at most also for his consort and his helpless infants, we do not need to have recourse to a miraculous interference of the deity or to empty the hypostasis of an innate urge toward association. Neither are we forced to assume that the isolated individuals or primitive hordes one day pledged themselves by a contract to establish social bonds. The factor that brought about primitive society and daily works toward its progressive intensification is human action that is animated by the insight into the higher productivity of labour achieved under the division of labour. Neither history, nor ethnology, nor any branch of knowledge can provide a description of the evolution which has led from the packs and flocks of mankind's non-human ancestors to the primitive yet already highly differentiated societal groups about which information is provided in the excavations, in the most ancient documents of history, and in the reports of explorers and travellers who have met savage tribes. The task with which science is faced in respect of the origins of society can only consist in the demonstration of those factors which can and must result in association and its progressive intensification. Praxeology solves the problem, if and as far as labour under the division of labour is more productive than isolated labour, and if and as far as man is able to realise this fact, human action itself tends toward cooperation and association. Man becomes a social being, not in sacrificing his own concerns for the sake of a mythical Moloch, society, but in aiming at an improvement in his own welfare. Experience teaches that this condition, higher productivity achieved under the division of labour, is present because its cause, the inborn equality of man and the inequality in the geographical distribution of the natural facts of production, is real. Thus, we are in a position to comprehend the course of social evolution. Current errors concerning the law of association. People cavil about much about Ricardo's law of association, better known under the law of comparative cost. The reason is obvious. This law is an offence to all those eager to justify protection in national economic isolation from any point of view other than the selfish interests of some producers or the issues of war preparedness. Ricardo's first aim in expounding this law was to refute an objection raised against freedom of international trade. The protectionist asks, what under free trade will be the fate of a country in which the conditions for any kind of production are less favourable than all other countries? Now, in a world in which there is free mobility not only for products, but no less for capital goods and for labour, a country so little suited for production would cease to be used as the seat of any human industry. If people fare better without exploiting the comparatively unsatisfactory physical conditions of production offered by this country, they will not settle here and will leave it as uninhabited as the polar regions, the tundras, and the deserts. But Ricardo deals with a world whose conditions are determined by settlement in earlier days, a world in which capital goods and labour are bound to the soil by definite institutions. In such a milieu, free trade, the free mobility of commodities only, cannot bring about a state of affairs in which capital and labour are distributed on the surface of the earth according to the better or poorer physical opportunities afforded to the productivity of labour. Here, the law of comparative cost comes into operation. Oh, seems to still be working. I'm sure someone. Are you Scottish? Sorry, I'm American and can't tell the difference. Yes, I am very Scottish. So Scottish that I then become confused for other ethnicities. I don't know if anyone is there in the chat and is currently listening. Do let me know if the stream is still functioning. I just had OBS on my end tell me that it wasn't briefly for a second. So I'll let that catch up with itself for a minute or so. I don't know. There's no F's in the chat, so I'm gonna assume everything is still carrying on well. Oops. Where did... Oh god, I'm so terrible at using this. Where did it go? Where did it go? That's where... tab just died now. Oops. Ignore the technical difficulties, please. They will be remedied in a moment, hopefully. Come on. Right, and there we go. Just like that, it's back. Stream buffer for a second, otherwise it's good. Still up. Right, cool. I should carry on then. Here the law of comparative cost comes into operation. Each country turns towards those branches of production for which its conditions offer comparatively, although not absolutely, the most favourable opportunities. For the inhabitants of a country, it is more advantageous to abstain from the exploitation of some opportunities which, absolutely and technologically, are more For the inhabitants of a country, it is more advantageous to abstain from the exploitation of some opportunities which, absolutely and technologically, are more propitious, and to import commodities produced abroad under conditions which, absolutely and technologically, are far less favourable than the unused domestic resources. The case is analogous to that of a surgeon who finds it convenient to employ for the cleaning of the operating room and the instruments a man whom he excels in this performance also, and to devote himself exclusively to surgery, in which his superiority is higher. The theorem of comparative costs is in no way connected with the value theory of classical economics. It did not deal with value or with prices. It is an analytical judgment, the conclusion of which is implied in the two propositions that technically movable factors of production differ with regard to their productivity in various places and are institutionally restricted in their mobility. The theorem, without prejudice to the correctness of its conclusion, can disregard problems of valuation because it is free to resort to a set of simple assumptions. These are that only two products are to be produced, that these products are freely movable, that for the production of each of them, two factors are required. That one of these factors, it may be either labour or capital goods, is identical in the production of both, while the other factor, a specific property of the soil, is different for each of the two processes. That the greater scarcity of the factor common to both processes determines the extent of the exploitation to the different factor. In the frame of these assumptions, which makes it possible to establish substitution ratios between the expenditure of the common factor and the output, the theorem answers the question raised. The law of comparative cost is as independent of the classical theory of value as is the law of returns, which its reasoning resembles. In both cases, we can content ourselves with comparing only physical input and physical output. With the law of returns, we compare the output of the same product. With the law of comparative costs, we compare the output of two different products. Such a comparison is feasible because we assume that production for each of them, apart from one specific factor, only non-specific factors of the same kind are required. Some critics blame the law of comparative costs for the simplification of assumptions. They believe that the modern theory of value would require a reformulation of the law in conformity with the principles of subjective value. Only such a formulation could provide a satisfactory conclusive demonstration. However, they do not want to calculate in terms of money. They prefer to resort to those methods of utility analysis which they consider a means for making value calculation in terms of utility. It will be shown in the further progress of our investigation that these attempts to eliminate monetary terms from economic calculation are delusive. Their fundamental assumptions are untenable and contradictory, and all formulas derived from them are vicious. No method of economic calculation is possible other than the one based on money prices as determined by the market. The meaning of the simple assumptions underlying the law of comparative cost is not precisely the same for the modern economists as it was for the classical economists. Some adherents of the classical school consider them as a starting point of a theory of value in international trade. We know now that they were mistaken in this belief. Besides, we realize that with regard to the determination of value and of prices, there is no difference between domestic and foreign trade. What makes people distinguish between the home market and markets abroad is only a difference in the data, i.e., varying institutional conditions regarding the mobility of factors of production and products. If we do not want to deal with the law of comparative cost under the simplified assumptions applied by Ricardo, we must openly employ money calculation. We must not fall prey to the illusion that a comparison between the expenditure of factors of production of various kinds and of the output of products of various kinds can be achieved without the aid of money calculation. If we consider the case of the surgeon and his handyman, we must say, if the surgeon can employ his limited working time for the performance of operations for which he is compensated at $50 per hour, it is to his interest to employ a handyman to keep his instruments in good order and to pay him $2 per hour, although this man needs 3 hours to accomplish what the surgeon could do in 1 hour. In comparing the conditions of two countries, we must say, if conditions are such that in England the production of 1 unit of each of the two commodities A and B requires the expenditure of 1 working day of the same kind of labour, while in India, with the same investment of capital for A 2 days and for B 3 days are required, and if capital goods A and B are freely movable from England to India and vice versa, whilst there is no mobility of labour wage rates in India, and the production of A must tend to be 50% and the production of B to 33 1/3% of the English rates. If the English rate is 6 shillings, the rates in India would be equivalent of 3 shillings in the production of A, and the equivalent of 2 shillings in the production of B. Such discrepancy in the remuneration of labour of the same kind cannot last if there is mobility of labour in the domestic Indian labour market. Workers would shift from the production of B into the production of A. The migration would tend to lower the remuneration in the A industry and to raise it in the B industry. Finally, Indian wage rates would be equal in both industries. The production of A would tend to expand and to supplant English competition. On the other hand, the production of B would become unprofitable in India and would have to be discontinued, while it would expand in England. The same reasoning is valid if we assume that the difference in the conditions of production consists also or exclusively in the amount of capital investment needed. It has been asserted that Ricardo's law was valid only for his age and is of no avail for our time, It has been asserted that Ricardo's law was valid only for his age, and is of no avail for our time, which offers other conditions. Ricardo saw the difference between domestic trade and foreign trade, and differences in the mobility of capital and labour. If one assumes that capital, labour, and products are movable, then there exists a difference between regional and interregional trade only as far as the cost of transportation comes into play. Then it is superfluous to develop a theory of international trade as distinguished from national trade. Capital and labour are distributed on the Earth's surface according to the better or poorer conditions which the various regions offer to production. There are areas more densely populated and better equipped with capital. There are others less densely populated and poorer in capital supply. There prevails on the whole earth a tendency toward an equalization of wage rates for the same kind of labour. Ricardo, however, starts from the assumption that there is a mobility of capital and labour only within each country and not between the various countries. He raises the question what the conditions. Can't read now. He raises the question what the consequences of the free mobility of products must be under such conditions. If there is no mobility of products either, then every country is economically isolated and autarkic, and there is no international trade at all. The theory of comparative cost answers this question. The Ricardo's assumptions by and large held good for his age. Later, in the course of the 19th century, conditions changed. The mobility of capital and labour gave way. International transfer of capital and labour became more and more common. Then came a reaction. Today, capital and labour are again restricted in their mobility. Reality again corresponds to the Ricardian assumptions. However, the teachings of the classical theory of interregional trade are above any change in institutional conditions. They enable us to study the problems involved under any imaginable assumptions. Section 5. The effects of the division of labour. The division of labour is the outcome of man's conscious reaction to the multiplicity of natural conditions. On the other hand, it is itself a factor bringing about differentiation. It assigns to the various geographic areas specific functions in the complex of the processes of production. It makes some areas urban, others rural. It locates the various branches manufacturing, mining, and agriculture in different places. Still more important, however, is the fact that it intensifies the innate inequality of man. Exercise and practice of specific tasks adjusts individuals better to the requirements of their performance. Men develop some of their inborn faculties and stunt the development of others. Vocational types emerge. People become specialists. The division of labour splits the various processes of production into minute tasks, each of which can be performed by mechanical devices. It is this fact that made use of the machinery possible and brought about the amazing improvements in technical methods of production. Mechanisation is the fruit of the division of labour, its most beneficial achievement, not its motive and fount and spring. Power-driven specialised machinery can be employed only in a social environment under the division of labour. Every step forward on the road toward the use of more specialised, more refined and more productive machines requires a further specialisation of tasks. Number 6. The individual within society. If praxeology speaks of a solitary individual acting on his own behalf only and independent of fellow men, it does so for the sake of a better comprehension of the problems of social cooperation. We do not assert that such isolated, autarkic human beings have ever lived, and that the social stage of man's history was preceded by an age of independent individuals roaming like animals in search of food. The biological humanization of man's non-human ancestors and the emergence of the primitive social bonds were affected in the same process. Man appeared on the scene of earthly events as a social being. The isolated asocial man is a fictitious construction. Seen from the point of view of the individual, society is the great means for the attainment of all its ends. The preservation of society is an essential condition of any plans an individual may want to realise by any action whatever. Even the refractory delinquent who fails to adjust his conduct to the requirements of life within the social system of cooperation does not want to miss any of the advantages derived from the division of labour. He does not consciously aim at the destruction of society. He wants to lay his hands on a greater portion of the jointly produced wealth than the social order assigns to him. He would feel miserable if antisocial behaviour were to become universal, and its inevitable outcome, the return to primitive indignance, resulted. Hmm. Oh, sorry, I just finished my tea there before it goes completely cold. Ugh, shudders. It is illusory to maintain that individuals, in renouncing the alleged blessings of a fabulous state of nature and entering into society, have forgone some advantages and have a fair claim to be indemnified for what they have lost. The idea that anybody would have fared better under an asocial state of mankind and is wronged by the very existence of society is absurd. Thanks to the higher productivity of social cooperation, the human species has multiplied far beyond the margin of subsistence offered by the conditions prevailing in ages with a rudimentary degree of the division of labour. Each man enjoys a standard of living much higher than that of his savage ancestors. The natural condition of man is extreme poverty and insecurity. It is romantic nonsense to lament the passing of the happy days of primitive barbarism. In a state of savagery, the complainants would either have not reached the age of manhood, or if they did, they would have lacked the opportunities and amenities provided by civilization. Jean-Jacques Rousseau and Friedrich Engels, if they had lived in the primitive state which they describe with nostalgic yearning, would not have enjoyed the leisure required for their studies and for the writing of their books. One of the privileges which society affords to the individual is the privilege of living in spite of sickness or physical disability. Sick animals are doomed. Their weakness handicaps them in their attempts to find food and to repel aggression on the part of other animals. Deaf, nearsighted, or crippled savages must perish. But such defects do not deprive a man of the opportunity to adjust himself to life in society. The majority of our contemporaries are afflicted with some bodily deficiencies which biology considers pathological. Our civilization is to a great extent the achievement of such men. The limited forces of natural selection are greatly reduced under social conditions. Hence, some people say that civilization tends to deteriorate the hereditary qualities of the members of society. Such judgments are reasonable if one looks at mankind with the eyes of a breeder, intent upon raising a race of men equipped with certain qualities. But society is not a stud farm operated for the production of a definite type of man. There is no natural standard to establish what is desirable and what is undesirable in the biological evolution of man. Any standard chosen is arbitrary, purely subjective, in short, a judgment of value. The terms racial improvement and racial degeneration are meaningless when not based on definite plans for the future of mankind. It is true, civilized man is adjusted to life in society and not to that of a hunter in virgin forests. The fable of the mystic communion. The praxeological theory of society is assailed by the fable of the mystic communion. Society asserts the supporters of this doctrine is not the product of man's purposeful action. It is not cooperation and division of tasks. It stems from unfathomable depths, from an urge ingrained in man's essential nature. It says one group, engrossment by the spirit which is divine reality and participation by virtue of a unio mystica and God's power and love. Another group sees society as a biological phenomenon. It is the work of the voice of the blood, the bond uniting the offspring of common ancestors with these ancestors and with one another, and the mystical harmony between the ploughman and the soil he tills. That such physical phenomena are really felt is true. There are people who experience unio mystica and place this experience above everything else, and there are men who are convinced that they hear the voice of the blood and smell with the heart and soul the unique scent of the cherished soil of their country. The mystical experience and the ecstatic rapture are facts which psychology must consider real. Like any other like any other physical phenomenon. The error of the commune doctrines or communion doctrines does not consist in their assertion that such phenomena really occur, but in the belief that they are primarily factors not dependent on any rational consideration. The voice of the blood which brings the father close to his child was not heard by those savages who do not know the causal relation between cohabitation and pregnancy. Today, as this relation is known to everybody, a man who has full confidence in his wife's fidelity may perceive it. But if there are doubts concerning the wife's fidelity, the voice of the blood is of no use. Nobody ever ventured to assert that doubts concerning paternity would be resolved by the voice of the blood. A mother who has kept watch over her child since birth can hear the voice of the blood. If she loses touch with the infant at an early date, she may later identify by some bodily marks, for instance those moles and scars which once were popular with novel writers. But the blood is mute if such observations and the conclusions derived from it do not make it speak. The voice of the blood contend the German race mysteriously unifies all members of the German people. But anthropology reveals the fact that the German nation is a mixture of the descendants of various races, subraces, and strains, and not a homogeneous stock descended from a common ancestry. The recently Germanized Slav, who has only a short time since changed his paternal family name for a German-sounding name, believes that he is substantially attached to all Germans, but he does not experience any such inner urge compelling him to join the ranks of his brothers or cousins who remained Czechs or Poles. The voice of the blood is not an original and primordial phenomenon. It is promoted by rational considerations because a man believes that he is related to other people by a common ancestry. He develops those feelings and sentiments which are poetically described as the voice of the blood. The same is true with regard to religious ecstasy and mysticism of the soil. Mysticism of the soil is connected with the development. The unio mystica of the devout mystic is conditioned by familiarity with the basic teachings of his religion. Only a man who has learned about the greatness and glory of God can experience direct communication with him. Mysticism of the soil is connected with the development of definite geopolitical ideas. Thus, it may happen that inhabitants of the plains of the seashore include in the image of the soil with which they claim to be fervently joined and united, mountain districts which are unfamiliar to them and to whose condition they could not adapt themselves, only because this territory belongs to the political body of which they are members, or would like to be members. On the other hand, they often fail to include in this image of the soil whose voice they claim to hear, neighbouring areas of a geographic structure very similar to that of their own country. These areas happen to belong to a foreign nation. The various members of a nation or linguistic group and the clusters they form are not always united in friendship and goodwill. A history of every nation is a record of mutual dislike and even hatred between its subdivisions. Think of the English and the Scotch. Scots. Bloody Mises. The Yankees and the Southerners, the Prussians and the Bavarians. It was ideologies that overcame such animosities and inspired all members of a nation or linguistic group which those feelings of community and belonging together which present-day nationalists consider a natural and original phenomenon. The mutual sexual attraction of male and female is inherent in man's animal nature and independent of any thinking and theorizing. It is permissible to call it original, vegetative, instinctive, or mysterious. There is no harm in asserting metaphorically that it makes one being out of two. We may call it a mystic communion of two bodies, a community. However, neither cohabitation nor what precedes it and follows generates social cooperation and societal modes of life. The animals too join together in mating, but they have not developed social relations. Family life is not merely a product of sexual intercourse. It is by no means natural and necessary that parents and children live together in the way which they do in the family. The mating relation need not result in a family organisation. The human family is an outcome of thinking, planning, and acting. It is this very fact which distinguishes it radically from those animal groups which we call per analogiam animal families. The mystical experience of communion or community is not the source of societal relations, but their product. The counterpart of the fable of mystical communion is the fable of a natural and original repulsion between races or nations. It is asserted that an instinct teaches man to distinguish congeners from strangers and to detest the latter. Scions of noble races abominate any contact with members of lower races. To refute this statement, one need only mention the fact of racial mixture, as there are in present-day Europe no pure stocks, we must conclude that between the members of the various stocks which once settled, and that the continent there was sexual attraction and not repulsion. Millions of mulattoes and other half-breeds are living counter-evidence to the assertion that there exists a natural repulsion between the various races. Like the mystical sense of communion, racial hatred is not a natural phenomenon innate in man. It is the product of ideologies, but even if such a thing as a natural and inborn hatred between various tribes existed, it would not render social cooperation futile and would not validate Ricardo's theory of association. Social cooperation has nothing to do with personal love or with a general commandment to love one another. People do not cooperate under the division of labour because they love or should love one another. They cooperate because this best serves their own interests. Neither love, nor charity, nor any other sympathetic sentiments, but rightly understood selfishness, is what originally impelled man to adjust himself to the requirements of society. To respect the rights and freedoms of his fellow man and to substitute peaceful collaboration for enmity and conflict. Number 7. The Great Society. Not every interhuman relation is a social relation. When groups of men rush upon one another in a war of outright extermination, when men fight against men as mercilessly as they crush pernicious animals and plants, there is, between the fighting parties, reciprocal effect and mutual relation, but no society. Society is joint action and cooperation, in which each participant sees the other partner's success as a means for the attainment of his own. The struggles in which primitive hordes and tribes fought one another for watering places, hunting and fishing grounds, pastures and booty were such pitiless wars of annihilation. They were total wars. So, in the 19th century were the first encounters of Europeans with the aborigines of territories newly made accessible. But already in the primeval age, long before the time of the historical records convey information, another mode of procedure began to develop. People preserved, even in warfare, some rudiments of social relations previously established in fighting against people with whom they'd never had any contact. They began to take into account the idea that between human beings, notwithstanding their immediate enmity, a later arrangement and cooperation is possible. Wars were waged to hurt the foe, but the hostile acts were no longer merciless and pitiless in the full sense of these terms. The belligerents began to respect certain limits in which a struggle against men, as differentiated from that against beasts, should not be transcended. Above the implacable hatred and the frenzy of destruction and annihilation, a societal element began to prevail. The idea emerged that every human adversary should be considered as a potential partner in a future cooperation, and that this fact should not be neglected in the conduct of military operations. War was no longer considered the normal state of interhuman relations. People recognized that peaceful cooperation is the best means to carry on the struggle for biological survival. We may even say that as soon as people realized that it is more advantageous to enslave the defeated than to kill them, the warriors, while still fighting, gave thought to the aftermath of the peace. Enslavement was by and large a preliminary step towards cooperation. The ascendancy of the idea that even in a war, not every act is to be considered permissible, that there are legitimate and illicit acts of warfare, that there are laws, i.e. societal relationships which are above all nations, even above those momentarily fighting one another, has finally established a great society embracing all men and all nations. The various regional societies were merged into ecumenical societies. The various regional societies were merged into one ecumenical society. Ecumenical society, however you pronounce that bloody word. Belligerents who did not wage war savagely in the manner of beasts, but according to human and social rules of warfare, renounced the use of some methods of destruction in order to obtain the same concessions on part of their foes. As far as such rules are complied with, social relations exist between the fighting parties. The hostile acts themselves are not only asocial, but antisocial. It is a mistake to define the term social relationships in such a way as to include actions which aim at other people's annihilation and at the frustration of their actions. Where the only relations between men and those directed at mutual determinant, there is neither society nor social relations. Society is not merely interaction. There is interaction, reciprocal influence between all parts of the universe, between the wolf and the sheep he devours, between the germ and the man it kills, between the falling stone and the thing which it falls upon. Society, on the other hand, always involves men acting in cooperation with other men in order to let all participants attain their own ends. Number 8. The instinct of aggression and destruction. It has been asserted that man is a beast of prey whose inborn natural instincts impel him to fight, to kill, and to destroy. Civilization, in creating unnatural humanitarian laxity, which alienates man from his original origin, or from his animal origin, has tried to quell these impulses and appetites. It has made civilized man a decadent weakling who is ashamed of his animality and proudly calls his depravity true humaneness. In order to prevent further degradation of the species man, it is imperative to free him from the pernicious effects of civilization, for civilization is merely a cunning invention of inferior men. These underlings are too weak to be a match for the vigorous heroes, they are too cowardly to endure the well-deserved punishment of complete annihilation, and they are too lazy and too insolent to serve the masters as slaves. Thus, they have resorted to a tricky makeshift. They have reversed the eternal standards of value absolutely fixed by the immutable laws of the universe. They have propagated a morality which calls their own inferiority virtue and the eminence of the noble heroes vice. This moral rebellion of the slaves must be undone by a transvaluation of all values. The ethics of the slaves, the shameful product of the resentment of weaklings, must be entirely disregarded. The ethics of the strong, or properly speaking, the nullification of any ethical restriction, must be substituted for it. Man must become a worthy scion of his ancestors, the noble beasts of days gone by. It is usual to call such doctrines social or sociological Darwinism. We need not decide here whether this terminology is appropriate or not. At any rate, it is a mistake to assign the epithets of evolutionary and biological to teachings which blithely disparage the whole of mankind's history from the ages in which man began to lift himself above the purely animal existence of his non-human ancestors as a continuous progression towards degeneration and decay. Biology does not provide any standard for the appraisal of changes occurring within living beings other than whether or not these changes succeeded in adjusting the individuals to the conditions of their environment and thereby in improving their chances in the struggle for survival. It is a fact that civilization, when judged from this point of view, is to be considered a benefit and not an evil. It has enabled man to hold his own in the struggle against all other living beings, both the big beasts of prey and even more pernicious microbes. It has multiplied man's means of sustenance. It has made the average man taller, more agile, and more versatile, and it has stretched his average length of life. It has given the man the uncontested mastery of the earth. It has multiplied population figures and raised the standards of living to a level never dreamed of by the crude cave dwellers of prehistoric ages. It is true that this evolution stunted the development of certain knacks and gifts which were once useful in the struggle for survival and have lost their usefulness under changed conditions. On the other hand, it developed other talents and skills which are indispensable for life within the frame of society. However, a biological and evolutionary view must not cavil at such changes. For primitive man, hard fists and pugnacity or punacity, or however that's pronounced, were as useful as the ability to be clever and God, let's try that one again. For primitive man, hard fists and pugnacity were as useful as the ability to be clever at arithmetic and to spell correctly are for modern man. It is quite arbitrary and certainly contrary to any biological standard to call only those characteristics which were useful to primitive man natural and adequate to human nature, and to condemn the talents and skills badly needed by civilized man as marks of degeneration and biological deterioration. To advise man to return to the physical and intellectual features of prehistoric ancestors is no more reasonable than to ask him to renounce his upright gait and to grow a tail again. It is noteworthy that the men who were foremost in extolling the eminence of the savage impulses of of our barbarian forefathers were so frail that their bodies would not have come up to the requirements of dangerous living. Nietzsche, even before his mental breakdown, was so sickly that the only climate he could stand was that of the Endigan Valley and of some Italian districts. He would not have been in a position to accomplish his work if civilized society had not protected his delicate nerves against the roughness of life. The apostles of violence wrote their books under the sheltering roof of bourgeois security, which they derided and disparaged. They were free to publish their incendiary sermons because the liberalism which they scorned safeguarded freedom of the press. They would have been desperate if they had to forego the blessings of the civilization scorned by their philosophy. And what a spectacle was that timid writer George Sorel, who went so far in his praise of brutality as to blame the modern system of education for weakening man's inborn tendencies towards violence. One may admit that in primitive man, the propensity for killing and destroying and the disposition for cruelty were innate. We may also assume that under the conditions of earlier ages, the inclination for aggression and murder was favourable to the preservation of life. Man was once a brutal beast. There was no need to investigate whether prehistoric man was a carnivore or a herbivore. But one must not forget that he was physically a weak animal. He would not have been a match for the big beasts of prey if he had not equipped with a peculiar weapon: reason. The fact that man is a reasonable being, that he therefore does not yield without inhibitions to every impulse, but arranges his conduct according to the reasonable deliberation, must not be called unnatural from a zoological point of view. Rational conduct means that man, in face of the fact that he cannot satisfy all his impulses, desires, and appetites, forgoes the satisfaction of those which he considers less urgent. In order not to endanger the working of social cooperation, man is forced to abstain from satisfying those desires whose satisfaction would hinder establishment of societal institutions. There is no doubt that such a renunciation is painful. However, man has made his choice. He has renounced the satisfaction of some desires incompatible with social life, and has given priority to the satisfaction of those desires which can be realized only in a more plentiful way under a system of the division of labour. He has entered upon the way towards civilization, social cooperation, and wealth. This decision is not irrevocable and final. The choice of the fathers does not impair the sons' freedom to choose. They can reverse the resolution. Every day they can proceed to the transvaluation of values and prefer barbarism to civilization, or, as some authors say, the soul to the intellect, myths to reason, and violence to peace. But they must choose. It is impossible to have things incompatible with one another. Science, from the point of view of its valuational neutrality, does not blame the apostles of the Gospels of violence for praising the frenzy of murder and the mad delights of sadism. Value judgments are subjective, and liberal society grants to everybody the right to express his sentiments freely. Civilization has not extirpated the original tendency towards aggression, bloodthirstiness, and cruelty which characterize primitive man. In many civilized men, they are dormant and burst forth as soon as the restraints developed by civilization give way. Remember the unspeakable horrors of the Nazi concentration camps. The newspapers continually report abominable crimes manifesting the latent urgence towards bestiality. The most popular novels and moving pictures are those dealing with bloodshed and violent acts. Bullfights and cockfights attract large crowds. If an author says the rabble thirst for blood, and I with them, he may be no less right than asserting that primitive man too took delight in killing. But he errs if he passes over the fact that the satisfaction of such sadistic desires impairs the existence of society, or if he asserts that true civilization and a good society are an achievement of people blithely indulging in their passions for violence, murder, and cruelty, that the repression of the impulses towards brutality endangers mankind's evolution, and that a substitution of barbarism for humanitarianism would save man from degeneration. The social division of labour and cooperation rests upon conciliatory settlements of disputes, not war, as Heraclitus said, but peace is the source of all social relations. To man, desires other than that for bloodshed are inborn. If he wants to satisfy these other desires, he must forego his urge to kill. He who wants to preserve life and health as well as long as possible must realise that respect for other people's lives and health better serves his aim than the opposite mode of conduct. One may regret that in such a state of affairs, but no such lamentations can alter the hard facts. It is useless to censure this statement by referring to irrationality. All instinctive impulses defy examination by reason because reason deals only with the means for attaining ends sought and not with the ultimate ends. But what distinguishes man from other animals is precisely that he does not yield without any will of his own to an instinctive urge. Man uses reason in order to choose between the incompatible satisfactions of conflicting desires. One must not tell the masses, indulge in your urge for murder. It is genuinely human and best serves your well-being. One must tell them, if you satisfy your thirst for blood, you must forego many other desires. You want to eat, to drink, to live in fine homes, to clothe yourselves, and 1,000 other things which only society can provide. You cannot have everything, you must choose. The dangerous life and frenzy of sadism may please you, but they are incompatible with the security and plenty which you do not want to miss either. Praxeology as a science cannot encroach upon the individual's rights to choose and act. The final decisions rest with the acting men, not with the theorists. Science's contribution to life and action does not consist in establishing value judgments, but in clarification of the conditions under which man must act, and an elucidation of the effects of various modes of action. It puts at the disposal of acting men all the information he needs in order to make his choices in fully awareness of their consequences. It prepares an estimate of cost and yield, as it were. It would fail in this task if it were to omit from the statement one of the items which could be of influence in people's choices and decisions. Current misinterpretations of modern natural science, especially of Darwinism. Some present-day anti-liberals, both of the right-wing and of the left-wing variety, base their teachings on misinterpretations of the achievements of modern biology. 1. Men are unequal. 18th century liberalism and likewise present-day egalitarianism start from the self-evident truth that all men are created equal, and that they are endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights. However, say the advocates of a biological philosophy of society, natural science has demonstrated in an irrefutable way that men are different. There is no room left in the framework of an experimental observation of natural phenomena for such a concept as natural rights. Nature is unfeeling and insensible with regard to any being's life and happiness. Nature is iron necessity and regularity. It is metaphysical nonsense to link together the slippery and vague notion of liberty and the unchangeable absolute laws of cosmic order. Thus, the fundamental idea of liberalism is unmasked as a fallacy. Now, it is true that the liberal and democratic movement of the 18th and 19th century drew a great part of its strength from the doctrine of natural law and innate imprescriptible rights of the individual. These ideas, first developed by ancient philosophy and Jewish theology, permeated Christian thinking. Some anti-Catholic sects made them the focal points of their political programs. A long line of eminent philosophers substantiated them. They became popular and were the most powerful moving force in the pre-democratic evolution. They are still supported today. Their advocates do not concern themselves with the incontestable fact that God or nature did not create men equal, since many are born hale and hearty, while others are crippled and deformed. With them, all differences between men are due to education, opportunity, and social institutions. But the teachings of utilitarian philosophy and classical economics have nothing to do with the doctrine of natural right. With them, the only point that matters is social utility. They recommend popular government, private property, tolerance, and freedom not because they are natural and just, but because they are beneficial. The core of Ricardo's philosophy is the demonstration that social cooperation and division of labour between men who are in every regard superior and more efficient, and men who are in every regard inferior and less efficient, is beneficial to both groups. Bentham, the radical, shouted, "Natural rights is simple nonsense, natural and imprescriptible rights rhetorical nonsense." With him, the sole object of government ought to be the greatest happiness to the greatest number of the community. Accordingly, in investigating what ought to be right, he does not care about preconceived ideas concerning gods or nature's plans and intentions, forever hidden to mortal men. He is intent upon discovering what best serves the promotion of human welfare and happiness. Malthus showed that nature, in limiting the means of subsistence, does not accord to any living being a right of existence, and that by indulging heedlessly in the natural impulse of proliferation, man would never have risen above the average verge of starvation. He contended that human civilization and well-being could develop only to the extent that man learned to rein his sexual appetites by moral restraint. The utilitarians do not combat arbitrary government and privileges because they are against natural law, but because they are detrimental to prosperity. They recommend equality under the civil law, not because men are equal, but because such a policy is beneficial to the commonwealth. And rejecting the illusory notions of natural law and human equality, modern biology only repeated what the utilitarian champions of liberalism and democracy long before had taught in a much more persuasive way. It is obvious that no biological doctrine can ever invalidate what utilitarian philosophy says about the social utility of democratic government, private property, freedom, and equality under the law. The present-day prevalence of doctrines approving such social disintegration and violent conflict is not the result of an alleged adaptation of social philosophy to the findings of biology, but of the almost universal rejection of utilitarian philosophy and economic theory. People have substituted an ideology of irreconcilable class conflict and international conflict for the orthodox ideology of the harmony of the rightly understood, i.e., long-run interest of all individuals, social groups, and nations. Men are fighting one another because they are convinced that the extermination and liquidation of adversaries is the only means of promoting their own well-being. The social implication of Darwinism, the theory of evolution as expounded by Darwin, says a school of social Darwinism has clearly demonstrated that in nature there are no such things as peace and respect for the lives and welfare of others. In nature, there is always struggle and merciless annihilation of the weak who do not succeed in defending themselves. Liberalism's plans for eternal peace, both in domestic and foreign relations, are the outcome of an illusory rationalism contrary to the natural order. However, the notion of the struggle for existence, as Darwin borrowed it from Malthus and applied it in his theory, is to be understood in a metaphorical sense. Its meaning is that a living being actively resists the forces detrimental to its own life. This resistance, if it is to succeed, must be appropriate to the environmental conditions in which the being concerned has to hold its own. It need not always be a war of extermination, such as in the relations between man and morbific microbes. Reason has demonstrated that, for man, the most adequate means of improving his condition is social cooperation and division of labour. They are man's foremost tool in the struggle for survival, but they can work only where there is peace. Wars, civil wars, and revolutions are detrimental to man's success in the struggle for existence because they disintegrate the apparatus of social cooperation. 3. Reason and rational behaviour are unnatural. Christian theology depreciated the animal functions of man's body and depicted the soul as something outside of all biological phenomena. In an excessive reaction against the philosophy, some moderns are prone to disparage everything in which man differs from other animals. In their eyes, human reason is inferior to animal instincts and impulses. It is unnatural and therefore bad. With them, the terms rationalism and rational behaviour With them, the terms rationalism and rational behaviour have an opprobrious connotation. The perfect man, the real man, is a being who obeys his primordial instincts more than his reason. The obvious truth is that reason, man's most characteristic feature, is also a biological phenomena. It is neither more nor less natural than any other feature of the species Homo sapiens, for instance, the upright gait or the hairless skin. Section 4. The role of ideas. Number 1. Human reason. Evolution, heliocentrism, Big Bang are BS theories to mind control the plebs. Everyone's desperate for an explanation. It doesn't need to be a good one. They'll take whatever one's going. Which I think is partially a point that Mises is almost kind of alluding to, without going fully down the roads of what would seem like possibly syndicalism in a lot of ways. Reason is man's particular and characteristic feature. There is no need for praxeology to raise the question whether reason is a suitable tool for the cognition of ultimate and absolute truth. It deals with reason only as far as it enables man to act. All those objects which are the substratum of human sensation, perception, and observation also pass before the senses of animals. But man alone has the faculty of transforming sensuous stimuli into observation and experience, and man alone can arrange his various observations and experience into a coherent system. Action is preceded by thinking. Thinking is to deliberate beforehand over future action, and to reflect afterward upon past action. Thinking and acting are inseparable. Every action is always based on a definite idea about causal relations. He who thinks a causal relation thinks a theorem. Action without thinking, practice without theory are imaginable. The reasoning may be faulty and the theory incorrect, but thinking and theorizing are not lacking in any action. On the other hand, thinking is always thinking of a potential action. Even he who thinks of a pure theory assumes that theory is correct, i.e., the action complying with its content would result in an effect to be expected from its teachings. Even he who thinks of pure, i.e., the action complying with its content would result in an effect to be expected from its teachings. It is of no relevance for logic whether such action is feasible or not. It is always the individual who thinks. Society does not think any more than it eats or drinks. The evolution of human reasoning from naive thinking of primitive man to the more subtle thinking of modern science took place within society. However, thinking itself is always an achievement of individuals. There is joint action, but no joint thinking. There is only tradition which preserves thoughts and communicates them to others as a stimulus to their thinking. However, man has no means of appropriating the thoughts of his precursors other than to think over them again. Then, of course, he is in a position to proceed farther on the basis of his forerunners, or his forerunners' thoughts, I should say. The foremost vehicle of tradition is the word. Thinking is linked up with language and vice versa. Concepts are embodied in terms. Language is a tool of thinking as it is a tool of social action. The history of thought and ideas is a discourse carried on from generation to generation. The thinking of later ages grows out of the thinking of earlier ages. Without the aid of this stimulation, and intellectual progress would have been impossible. The continuity of human evolution, sowing for the offspring and harvesting on land, cleared and tilled by the ancestors, manifests itself into the history of science and ideas. We have inherited from our forefathers not only a stock of products of various orders of goods, which is the source of our material wealth, we have no less inherited ideas and thoughts, theories and technologies to which our thinking owes its productivity. But thinking is always a manifestation of individuals. Number 2. Worldview and Ideology. The theories directing action are often imperfect and unsatisfactory. They may be contradictory and unfit to be arranged into a comprehensive and coherent system. If you look at all the theorems and theories guiding the conduct of certain individuals and groups as a coherent complex and try to arrange them as far as is feasible into a system, i.e., a comprehensive body of knowledge, we may speak of it as a worldview. A worldview is, as a theory, an interpretation of all things, and a precept for action, an opinion concerning the best means for removing uneasiness as much as possible. A worldview is thus, on the one hand, an explanation of all phenomena and, on the other hand, a technology, both these terms being taken in their broadest sense. Religion, metaphysics, and philosophy aim at providing a worldview. They interpret the universe and they advise men how to act. The concept of an ideology is narrower than that of a worldview. In speaking of ideology, we have in view only human action and social cooperation, and disregard the problem of metaphysics, religious dogma, the natural sciences, and the technologies derived from them. Ideology is the totality of our doctrines concerning individual conduct and social relations. Both worldview and ideology go beyond the limits imposed upon a purely neutral and academic study of things as they are. They are not only scientific theories, but also doctrines about the ought, i.e., about the ultimate ends which man should aim at in his earthly concerns. Asceticism teaches that only means open to man for removing pain and for attaining complete quietude, contentment, and happiness is to turn away from earthly concerns and to live without bothering about worldly things. There is no salvation other than to renounce striving after material well-being, to endure submissively the adversities of the earthly pilgrimage, and to dedicate oneself exclusively to the preparation for eternal bliss. However, the number of those who consistently and unswervingly comply with the principles of asceticism is so small that it is not easy to instance more than a few names. It seems that the complete passivity advocated by asceticism is contrary to nature. The enticement of life triumphs. The ascetic principles have been adulterated. Even the most saintly hermits made concessions to life and early concerns which did not agree with their rigid principles. But as soon as man takes into account any earthly concerns and substitutes for purely vegetative ideals an acknowledgement of worldly things, however conditions and incompatible with the rest of his professed doctrine, he bridges over the gulf which separated him from those who say yes to the striving after earthly ends. Then he has something in common with everyone else. Human thoughts about things of which neither pure reasoning nor experience provide any knowledge may differ so radically that no agreement can be reached. In this sphere, in which the free revere of the mind is restricted neither by logical thinking nor by sensory experience, man can give vent to his individuality and subjectivity. Nothing is more personal than the notions and images about the transcendent. Linguistic terms are unable to communicate what is said about the transcendent. One can never establish whether the hearer conceives that in the same way as the speaker. With regard to the things beyond there can be no agreement. Religious wars are the most terrible wars because they are waged without any prospect of conciliation. But where earthly things are involved, the natural affinity of all men and the identity of the biological conditions for the preservation of their lives comes into play. The higher productivity of cooperation under division of labour makes society the foremost means of every individual for the attainment of his own ends, whatever they may be. The maintenance and further intensification of social cooperation become a concern of everybody. Every worldview and every ideology which is not entirely and unconditionally committed to the practice of asceticism and to life and anacrotic reclusion must pay heed to the fact that society is the great means for the attainment of earthly ends. But then a common ground is one to clear the way for an agreement concerning minor social problems and the details of society's organisation. However various ideologies may conflict with one another, they harmonise on one point, and the acknowledgement of life and society. People fail sometimes to see this fact because in dealing with philosophies and ideologies they look more at what these doctrines assert with regard to transcendent and unknowable things and less at their statements about action in this world. Between various parts of an ideological system there is often an unbridgeable gulf. For acting man, only those teachings are of real importance, which result in precepts for action, not those doctrines which are purely academic and do not apply to conduct within the frame of social cooperation. We may disregard the philosophy of adamant and consistent asceticism because such a rigid asceticism must ultimately result in the extinction of its supporters. All other ideologies, in approving of the search for the necessities of life, are forced in some measure to take into account the fact that the division of labour is more productive than isolated work. They thus admit the need for social cooperation. Praxeology and economics are not qualified to deal with the transcendent and metaphysical aspects of any doctrine, but, on the other hand, no appeal to any religious or metaphysical dogmas and creeds can invalidate the theorems and theories concerning social cooperation as developed by logically correct praxeological reasoning. If a philosophy has admitted the necessity of societal links between men, it has placed itself, as far as the problems of social action come into play, on ground from which there is no escape into personal convictions and professions of faith not liable to a thorough examination by methods of science. The fundamental fact is often ignored. People believe that differences in worldview create irreconcilable conflicts. The basic antagonisms between parties committed to different worldviews, it is contended, cannot be settled. The basic antagonisms between parties committed to different worldviews, it is contended, cannot be settled by compromise. They stem from the deepest recesses of the human soul and are expressive of a man's innate communion with supernatural and eternal forces. There can never be any cooperation between people divided by different worldviews. However, if we pass in review the programs of all parties, both the cleverly elaborated and publicized programs and those to which the parties really cling when in power, we can easily discover the fallacy of this interpretation. All present-day political parties strive after the earthly well-being and prosperity of their supporters. They promise that they will render economic conditions more satisfactory to their followers. With regard to this issue, there is no difference between the Roman Catholic Church and the various Protestant denominations as far as they intervene in political and social questions. Between Christianity and the non-Christian religions, between the advocates of economic freedom and the various brands of Marxian materialism, between nationalists and internationalists, between racists and the friends of the interracial peace. It is true that many of these parties believe that their own group cannot prosper except at the expense of other groups, and even go so far as to consider the complete annihilation of other groups so their enslavement as a necessary condition of their own group's prosperity. Yet, extermination or enslavement of others is for them not an ultimate end, but a means for the attainment of what they aim at as an ultimate end, their own group's flowering. If they were to learn that their own designs are guided by spurious theories and would not bring about the beneficial results expected, they would change their programs. The pompous statements which people make about things unknowable and beyond the power of the human mind, their cosmologies, worldviews, religions, mysticisms, metaphysics, and conceptual fantasies differ widely from one another. But the practical essence of their ideologies, i.e., their teachings, dealing with the ends to be aimed at in earthly life and with the means for the attainment of these ends, shows much uniformity. There are, to be sure, differences and antagonisms both with regard to ends and means, yet the differences with regard to ends are not irreconcilable. They do not hinder cooperation and amicable arrangements in the sphere of social action. As far as they concern means and ways only, they are of purely technical character and as such open to examination by rational methods. When in the heat of party conflicts one of the factions declares, "Here, we cannot go in our negotiations with you because we are faced with a question touching upon our worldview. On this point, we must be adamant and must cling rigidly to our principles whatever may result." One need only scrutinize matters more carefully to realize that such declarations describe the antagonism as more pointed than it really is. In fact, for all parties committed to pursuit of the people's earthly welfare and thus approving social cooperation, questions of social organization and the conduct of social action are not problems of ultimate principles and of worldviews, but ideological issues. They are technical problems with regard to which some arrangement is always possible. No party would wittingly prefer social disintegration, anarchy, and a return to primitive barbarism to a solution which must be brought at the price of the sacrifice of some ideological points. In party programs, these technical issues are, of course, of primary importance. A party is committed to certain means. It recommends certain methods of political action and rejects utterly all other methods and policies as inappropriate. A party is a body which combines all those eager to employ the same means for common action. The principle which differentiates man and integrates parties is the choice of means. Thus, for the party, as such the means chosen are essential. A party is doomed if the futility of the means recommended becomes obvious. Party chiefs whose prestige and political career are bound up with the party's programme may have ample reason for withdrawing its principles from unrestricted discussion. They may attribute to them the character of ultimate ends which must not be questioned because they are based on a worldview. But for the people as whose mandatories the party's chief pretend to act, for the voters whom they want to enlist, and for whose votes they canvass, things offer another aspect. They have no objection to scrutinising every point of a party's programme. They look upon such a programme only as a recommendation of means for the attainment of their own ends, vis-a-vis earthly well-being. What divides these parties, which one calls today worldview parties, i.e. parties committed to basic philosophical decisions about ultimate ends, is only seemingly disagreement with regard to ultimate ends. Their antagonisms refer either to religious creeds or to problems of international relations or to the problem of ownership of the means of production or to the problems of political organisation. It can be shown that all these controversies concern means and not ultimate ends. Let us begin with the problem of a nation's political organisation. There are supporters of a democratic system of government and of hereditary monarchy, of the rule of a self-styled elite, and of a Caesarist dictatorship. It is true that these programs are often recommended by reference to divine institutions, to the eternal laws of the universe, to the natural order, to the inevitable trend of historical evolution, and to other objects of transcendent knowledge. But such statements are merely incidental adornment. In appealing to the electorate, the parties advance other arguments. They are eager to show that the system they support will succeed better than those advocated by other parties in realising whose ends which the citizens aim at. They specify the beneficial results achieved in the past or in other countries. They disparage the other parties' programmes by relating their failures. They resort both to pure reason and to an interpretation of historical experience in order to demonstrate the superiority of their own proposals and the futility of their own adversaries. Their main argument, as always, the political system we support will render you more prosperous and more content. In the field of society's organisation, there are the liberals advocating private ownership of the means of production, the socialists advocating public ownership of the means of production, and the interventionists advocating a third system which they contend is as far from socialism as it is from capitalism. In the clash of these parties, there is again much talk about basic philosophical issues. People speak of true liberty, equality, social justice, the rights of the individual, community, solidarity, and humanitarianism. But each party is intent upon proving by ratiocination and by referring to historical experience that only the system it recommends will make the citizens prosperous and satisfied. They tell the people that realisation of their programme will raise their standard of living to a higher level than the realisation of any other party's programme. They insist upon the expediency of their plans and upon their utility. It is obvious that they do not differ from one another with regard to ends, but only as a means, they do not differ with regard to ends. I'm sorry, I've lost myself there. It is obvious that they do not differ from one another with regard to ends, but only as to means. They all pretend to aim at the highest material welfare for the majority of citizens. The nationalists stress there is a irreconcilable conflict between the interests of various nations, but that, on the other hand, the rightly understood interests of all citizens within the nation are harmonious. A nation can prosper only at the expense of other nations. The individual citizen can fare well only if his nation flourishes. The liberals have a different opinion. They believe that the interests of various nations harmonise no less than those of the various groups, classes, and strata of individuals within a nation. They believe that peaceful international cooperation is a more appropriate means than conflict for the attainment of ends which they and the nationalists are both aiming at, their own nation's welfare. They do not, as the nationalists charge, advocate peace and free trade in order to betray their own nation's interests to those of foreigners. On the contrary, they consider peace and free trade as the best means to make their own nation wealthy. What separates the free traders from the nationalists is not ends, but the means recommended for the attainment of the ends common to both. Dissension with regard to religious creeds cannot be settled by rational methods. Religious conflicts are essentially implacable and irreconcilable, yet as soon as a religious community enters the field of political action and tries to deal with the problems of social organisation, it is bound to take into account earthly concerns. However, this may conflict with its dogma and articles of faith. No religion and its exoteric activities are ever ventured to tell people frankly, the realization of our plans for social organization will make you poor and impair your earthly well-being. Those consistently committed to a life of poverty withdrew from the political scene and fled into Those consistently committed to a life of poverty withdrew from the political scene and fled into anchorotic seclusion. The churches and religious communities which have aimed at making converts and at influencing political and social activities of their followers have espoused the principles of secular conduct. In dealing with questions of man's earthly pilgrimage, they hardly differ from any other political organisation. In canvassing, they emphasise the material advantages which they have in store for their brothers in faith more than the blisses in the beyond. Only a worldview whose supporters renounce any earthly activity whatever could neglect to pay heed to the rational considerations which show that social cooperation is the great means for the attainment of all human ends. Because man is a social animal that can thrive only within society, all ideologies are forced to acknowledge the preeminent importance of social cooperation. They must aim at the most satisfactory organisation of society and must approve of man's concern for an improvement of his material well-being. Thus, they all place themselves upon a common ground. They are separated from one another not by worldviews and transcendent issues not subject to reasonable discussion, but by problems of means and ways. Such ideological antagonisms are open to a thorough scrutiny by the scientific model of praxeology and economics. The fight against error. A critical examination of the philosophical systems constructed by mankind's greatest thinkers has very often revealed fissures and flaws in the impressive structure of those seemingly consistent and coherent bodies of comprehensive thought. Even the genius in drafting a worldview sometimes fails to avoid contradictions and fallacious syllogisms. The ideologies accepted by public opinion are still more infected by the shortcomings of the human mind. They are mostly an eclectic juxtaposition of ideas utterly incompatible with one another. They cannot stand the logical examination of their content. Their inconsistencies are irreparable and defy any attempt to combine their various parts into a system of ideas compatible with one another. Some authors try to justify the contradictions of generally accepted ideologies by pointing out the alleged advantages of a compromise. However, unsatisfactory from the logical point of view for the smooth functioning of interhuman relations, they refer to the popular fallacy that life and reality are not logical. They contend that a contradictory system may improve its expediency or even its truth by working satisfactorily, while a logically consistent system would result in disaster. There is no need to refute anew such popular errors. Logical thinking and real life are not two separate orbits. Logic is for man the only means to master the problems of reality. What is contradictory in theory is no less contradictory in reality. No ideological consistency can provide a satisfactory, i.e., working solution for the problems offered by the facts of the world. The only effect of contradictory ideologies is to conceal the real problems and thus to prevent people from finding in a time an appropriate policy for solving them. Inconsistent ideology may sometimes postpone the emergence of a manifest conflict, but they certainly aggravate the evils which they mask and render a final solution more difficult. They multiply the agonies, they intensify the hatreds, and make peaceful settlement impossible. It is a serious blunder to consider ideological contradictions harmless or even beneficial. The main objective of praxeology and economics is to substitute consistent, correct ideologies for the contradictory tenets of popular eclecticism. There is no other means of preventing social disintegration and of safeguarding the steady improvement of human conditions than those provided by reason. Men must try to think through all the problems involved up to the point beyond which a human mind cannot proceed farther. They must never acquiesce in any solutions conveyed by older generations. They must always question anew every theory and every theorem. They must never relax in their endeavours to brush away fallacies and to find the best possible cognition. They must fight error by unmasking spurious doctrines and by expounding truth. The problems involved are purely intellectual and must be dealt with as such. It is disastrous to shift them to the moral sphere and to dispose of supporters of opposite ideologies by calling them villains. It is vain to insist that what we are aiming at is good and what our adversaries want is bad. The question to be solved is precisely what is to be considered as good and what is bad. The rigid dogmatism peculiar to religious groups and to Marxism presents only an irreconcilable conflict. It condemns beforehand all dissenters as evildoers. It calls into question their good faith. It asks them to surrender unconditionally. No social cooperation is possible where such an attitude prevails. No better is the propensity, very popular nowadays, to brand supporters of other ideologies as lunatics. Psychiatrists are vague in drawing a line between sanity and insanity. It would be preposterous for laymen to interfere with this fundamental issue of psychiatry. However, it is clear that if the mere fact that a man shares erroneous views and acts according to his error disqualifies him as mentally disabled, it would be very hard to discover an individual to which the epithet sane or normal could be attributed. Then, we are bound to call the past generations lunatic because their ideas about the problems of the natural sciences and concomitantly their techniques differed from ours. Coming generations will call us lunatics for doing the same reason. For the same reason. Man is liable to error. If to err were the characteristic feature of mental disability, then everybody should be called mentally disabled. Neither can the fact that a man is at variance with the opinions held by the majority of his contemporaries qualify him as a lunatic. Were Copernicus, Galileo, and Lavoisier insane? It is the regular course of history that a man conceives new ideas contrary to those of other people. Some of these ideas are later embodied in a system of knowledge accepted by public opinion as true. Is it permissible to apply the epithet sane only to boors who never had ideas of their own and to deny it to all innovators? The procedure of some contemporary psychiatrists is really outrageous. They are utterly ignorant of the theories of praxeology and economics. Their familiarity with present-day ideologies is superficial and uncritical. Yet they blithely call the supporters of some ideologies paranoid persons. There are men who are commonly stigmatized as monetary cranks. The monetary crank suggests a method for making everybody prosperous by monetary measures. His plans are illusory. However, they are the consistent application of a monetary ideology entirely approved by contemporary public opinion and espoused by the policies of almost all governments. The objections raised by these ideological errors by the economists are not taken into account by the governments, political parties, and the press. It is generally believed that those unfamiliar with economic theory that credit expansion and an increase in the quantity of money in circulation are efficacious means for lowering the rate of interest permanently below the height it would attain on a non-manipulated capital and loan market. This theory is utterly illusory, but it guides the monetary and credit policy of almost every contemporary government. Now, on the basis of this vicious ideology, no valid objection could be raised against the plans advanced by Pierre-Joseph Proudhon, Ernest Solvay, Clifford Hugh Douglas, and a host of other would-be reformers. They are only more consistent than the other people. They want to reduce the interest rate to zero, and thus to abolish altogether the scarcity of capital. He who wants to refute them must attack the theories underlying the monetary and credit policies of the great nations. The psychiatrist may object that what characterizes a man as a lunatic is precisely the fact that he lacks moderation and goes to extremes. While normal man is judicious enough to restrain himself, the paranoid person goes beyond all bounds. This is quite an unsatisfactory rejoinder. All the arguments advanced in favour of the thesis that the rate of interest can be reduced by credit expansion from 5% to 4% to 3% to 2% are equally valid for a reduction to zero. The monetary cranks are certainly right from the point of view of the monetary fallacies approved by popular opinion. There are psychiatrists who call the Germans who espouse the principles of Nazism lunatics and want to cure them by therapeutic procedures. Here again, we are faced with the same problem. The doctrines of Nazism are vicious, but they do not essentially disagree with the ideologies of socialism and nationalism as approved by other people's public opinion. What characterized the Nazis was only the consistent application of these ideologies to the special conditions of Germany. Like all other contemporary nations, the Nazis desired government control of business and economic self-sufficiency, i.e., autarky for their own nation. The distinctive mark of their policy was that they refused to acquiesce in the disadvantages which the acceptance of the same system by other nations would impose upon them. They were not prepared to be forever imprisoned, as they said, with a comparatively overpopulated area in which physical conditions rendered the productivity of labour lower than in other countries. They believed that their nation's great population figures, the strategically propitious geographic situation of their country, and the inborn vigour and gallantry of their armed forces provided them with a good chance to remedy by aggression the evils they deplored. Now, whoever accepts the ideology of nationalism, socialism as true and as the standard of his own nation's policy is not in a position to refute the conclusions drawn from them by the Nazis. The only way for a reputation of Nazism left for foreign nations which have espoused these two principles is to defeat the Nazis in war. And as long as the ideology of socialism and nationalism is supreme in the world's public opinion, the Germans or other people will try to succeed by aggression and conquest, should the opportunity ever be afforded to them. There is no hope of eradicating the aggression mentality if one does not explode entirely this ideological fallacies from which it stems. This is not a task for psychiatrists, but for economists. What is wrong with the Germans is necessarily not that they do not comply with the teachings of the Gospels. No nation ever did. With the exception of the small and uninfluential groups of friends, practically all Christian churches and sects blessed the arms of the warriors. The most ruthless among the older German conquerors were the Teutonic Knights who fought in the name of the cross. The source of present-day German aggressiveness is the very fact that the Germans have discarded liberal philosophy and substituted the ideology of nationalism and socialism for the liberal principles of free trade and peace. If mankind has not returned to these ideas today disparaged as orthodox, Manchester philosophy and laissez-faire, the only method to prevent a new aggression is to render the German innocuous by depriving them of the means of waging war. Man has only one tool to fight error: reason. Number 3. Might. Society is a product of human action. Human action is directed by ideologies. Thus, society and any concrete order of social affairs are an outcome of ideologies. Ideologies are not, as Marxism asserts, a product of a certain state of social affairs. To be sure, human thoughts and ideas are not the achievement of isolated individuals. Thinking too succeeds only through the cooperation of the thinkers. No individual would make headway in his reasoning if he were under the necessity of starting from the beginning. A man can advance in thinking only because his efforts are aided by those of older generations who have formed the tools of thinking, the concepts and terminologies, and have raised the problems. Any given social order was thought out and designed before it could be realised. This temporal and logical precedence of the ideological factor does not imply the proposition that people draft a complete plan of a social system as the utopians do. What is and must be thought out and advanced is not the concerting of the individual's actions into an integrated system of social organisation, but the actions of individuals with regard to their fellow men and of already formed groups of individuals with regard to other groups. Before a man aids his fellow in cutting a tree, such cooperation must be thought out. Before an act of barter takes place, the idea of mutual exchange of goods and services must be conceived. It is not necessary that the individuals concerned become aware of the fact that such mutuality results in the establishment of social bonds and in the emergence of a social system. The individual does not plan and execute actions intended to construct society. His conduct and the corresponding conduct of others generate social bodies. Any existing state of social affairs is the product of ideologies previously thought out. Within society, new ideologies may emerge and may supersede older ideologies and thus transform the social system. However, society is always the creation of ideologies temporarily and logically anterior. Action is always directed by ideas. It realizes what previous thinking has designed. If we hypothesize or anthropomorphize the notion of ideology, we might say that ideologies have might over men. Might is the faculty or power of directing actions. As a rule, one says only of a man or of groups of men that they are mighty. Then the definition of might is the power of the power to direct other people's actions. He who is mighty owes his might to an ideology. Only ideologies can convey to a man the power to influence other people's choices and conduct. One man can become a leader only if one is supported by an ideology which makes other people tractable and accommodating. Might is thus not a physical and tangible thing, but a moral and spiritual phenomenon. A king's might rests upon the recognition of the monarchical ideology on the part of his subjects. He who uses his might to run the state, i.e., the social apparatus of coercion and compulsion, rules. Rule is the exercise of might in the political body. Rule is always based upon might, i.e., power to direct other people's actions. Of course, it is possible to establish a government upon the violent oppression of reluctant people. It is a characteristic mark of state and government that they apply violent coercion or the threat of it against those not prepared to yield voluntarily. Yet such violent oppression is no less founded upon ideological might. He who wants to apply violence needs the voluntary cooperation of some people. An individual entirely dependent on himself can never rule by means of physical violence only. He needs the ideological support of a group in order to subdue other groups. The tyrant must have a retinue of partisans who obey his orders of their own accord. Their spontaneous obedience provides him with the apparatus he needs for the conquest of other people. Whether or not he succeeds in making his sway last depends on the numerical relation of the two groups, those who support him voluntarily and those whom he beats into submission. Though a tyrant may temporarily rule through a minority if this minority is armed and the majority is not, in the long run a minority cannot keep the majority in subservience. The oppressed will rise in rebellion and cast off the yoke of tyranny. A durable system of government must rest upon an ideology acknowledged by the majority. The real factors, the real forces that are the foundation of government and convey to the rulers the power to use violence against retinent minority groups are essentially ideological, moral, and spiritual. Rulers who fail to recognize this first principle of government and relying upon the alleged irresistibility of their armed troops disdain the spirit and ideas, have finally been overthrown by the assault of their adversities. The interpretation of might as a real factor not dependent upon ideologies, quite common to many political and historical books, is erroneous. The term realpolitik makes sense only if used to signify a policy taking account of generally accepted ideologies as contrasted with a policy based upon ideologies not sufficiently acknowledged and therefore unfit to support a durable system of government. He who interprets might as physical or real power to carry on and considers violent action as the very foundation of government sees conditions from the narrow point of view of subordinate officers in charge of sections of an army or police force. To these subordinates, a definite task within the framework of the ruling ideology is assigned. Their chiefs commit to their care troops which are not only equipped, armed, and organised for combat, but no less imbued with the spirit which makes them obey the orders issued. The commanders of such subdivisions consider this moral factor a matter of course, because they themselves are animated by the spirit and cannot even imagine a different ideology. The power of an ideology consists precisely in the fact that people submit to it without any wavering or scruples. However, things are different for the head of the government. He must aim at preservation of the moral or the armed forces and of the loyalty and of the rest of the population. For these moral facts are the only real elements upon which continuance of his mastery rests. His power dwindles if the ideology that supports it disappears. Minorities too can sometimes conquer by means of superior military skill, and can thus establish minority rule. But such an order of things cannot endure. If the victorious conquerors do not succeed in subsequently converting the system of rule by violence into a system of rule by ideological consent on the part of those ruled, who have established a lasting system of government, have made their sway durable by means of a belated ideological ascendancy. They have legitimized their own supremacy either by submitting to the ideologies of the defeated or by the transforming of them. Whether neither of these two things took place, the oppressed whether neither of these two things took place, the oppressed many dispossessed the oppressing few by open rebellion or through the silent but steadfast operation of ideological forces. Many of the great historical conquests were able to endure because the invaders entered into alliance with those classes of the defeated nation which were supported by the ruling ideology, and were thus considered legitimate rulers. This was the system adopted by the Tartars in Russia, by the Turks in the Danube principalities, and by large in Hungary and Transylvania, and by the British and the Dutch in the Indies. A comparatively insignificant number of Britons could rule many hundred millions of Indians because the Indian princes and aristocratic landowners looked upon British rule as a means for the preservation of their privileges and supplied it with the support which the generally acknowledged ideology of India gave to their own supremacy. England's Indian Empire was as firm as long as public opinion approved the traditional social order. The Pax Britannica safeguarded the princes and the landlords, privileges, and protected the masses against the agonies of wars between the principalities and of its succession wars within them. In our day, the infiltration of subversive ideas from abroad has undermined British rule and at the same time threatens the preservation of the country's age-old social order. Victorious minorities sometimes owe their successes to their technological superiority. This does not alter the case. In the long run, it is impossible to withhold the better arms for the members of the majority. Not the equipment of their armed forces, but ideological factors safeguarded the British in India. A country's public opinion may be ideologically divided in such a way that no group is strong enough to establish a durable government. The anarchy emerges, revolutions and civil strife become permanent. Oh, right. I am quickly going to give myself a break while I go for a pee. So enjoy placeholder image. I believe this one was requested by Not Sure the other day, but I haven't seen him in chat, so I'm sure he will catch up with it in time, and I will be back in a couple of minutes. Oh, right, and back. For those who are unaware, I don't know how you would be, because I keep going on about it and I've been sharing the page everywhere. I'm doing a live reading of Human Action, admittedly in segments, as part of a fundraising sort of, what would even, I'd just call it a fundraiser, I suppose, so that I can make it to the Mises Institute in July of this year and take advantage of the opportunity that they have given me. And if you would like to help with that, please go have a look for the GoFundMe. It is the pinned message in the chat, and it is also in the description. And if you aren't able to donate, which I perfectly understand, if you could share the fund with other people, that would be very much appreciated, as would be sharing the streams themselves. However, I understand very much that it is not something that everybody wants to sit through. I think I've really just piqued the interest of a small number of people who hadn't read Human Action probably prior to and are just looking at it as an excuse to listen to it. But hey ho, I've got to make a start somewhere. Go away, fucking Tinder bot. Nobody wants you. Where the... God, those bots always just seem to show up at us just after like the 2 hour mark. I have no clue how they work. Oh, right. Traditionalism as an ideology. Traditionalism is an ideology which considers loyalty to valuations, customs, and methods of procedure handed down or allegedly handed down from ancestors both right and experienced. It is not an essential mark of traditionalism that the forefathers were the ancestors in the biological meaning of the term, or can be fairly considered such. They were sometimes only the previous inhabitants of the country concerned, or supporters of the same religious creed, or only precursors in the exercise of some special task. Who is to be considered an ancestor and what is the content of the body of tradition handed down are determined by the concrete teachings of each variety of traditionalism. The ideology brings into prominence some of the ancestors and relegates others to oblivion. It sometimes calls ancestors people who had nothing to do with the alleged posterity. It often constructs a traditional doctrine which is of its recent origin and is at variance with the ideologies really held by the ancestors. Traditionalism tries to justify its tenets by citing the success they secured in the past. Whether this assertion conforms with the facts is another question. Research could sometimes unmask errors in the historical statement of a traditional belief. However, this did not always explode the traditional doctrine, for the core of traditionalism is not real historical facts, but opinion about them, however mistaken, and a will to believe things to which the authority of ancient origin is attributed. Number 4. Ameliorism and the idea of progress. The notions of progress and retrogression make sense only within a teleological system of thought. In such a framework, it is sensible to call approach toward the goal aimed at progress and a movement in the opposite direction retrogression. Without reference to some agent's action and to a definite goal, both these notions are empty and void of any meaning. It was one of the shortcomings of the 19th century philosophies to have misinterpreted the meaning of cosmic change and to have smuggled into the theory of biological transformation the idea of progress. Looking backward from any given state of things to the state of the past, one can fairly use the term development and evolution in a neutral sense. Then, evolution signifies a process which led from the past conditions to the present. But one must guard against the fatal error of confusing change with improvement and evolution, which evolution toward higher forms of life. Neither is it permissible to substitute a pseudoscientific anthropocentrism for the anthropocentrism of religion and the older metaphysical doctrines. However, there is no need for praxeology to enter into a critique of his philosophy. Its task is to explode the errors implied in current ideologies. 18th century social philosophy was convinced that mankind was now finally entered the age of reason. While in the past theological and metaphysical errors were dominant, henceforth reason will be supreme. People will free themselves more and more from their chains of tradition and superstition and will dedicate all their efforts to the continuous improvement of social institutions. Every new generation will contribute its part to this glorious task. With the progress of time, society will, more and more, become the society of free men. Aiming at the great happiness of the greatest number, temporary setbacks are of course not impossible, but finally the good cause will triumph because it is the cause of reason. People called themselves happy and that they were citizens of an age of enlightenment, which through the discovery of laws of rational conduct paved the way towards a steady amelioration of human affairs. What they lamented was only the fact that they themselves were too old to witness all the beneficial effects of the new philosophy. I would wish, said Bentham to Philorate Challes, to be granted the privilege to live the years which I still have to live at the end of each of the centuries following my death. Thus I could witness the effects of my writing. Too fucking right you would, pal. All these hopes were founded on the firm conviction proper to the age that the masses are both morally good and reasonable. The upper strata, the privileged aristocrats living on the fat of the land, were thought depraved. The common people, especially the peasants and the workers, were glorified in their romantic mood as noble and unerring in their judgment. Thus, the philosophers were confident that democracy, government by the people, would bring about the social perfection. This prejudice was the fateful error of the humanitarians, the philosophers, and the liberals. Men are not infallible. They err very often. It is not true that the masses are always right and know the means for attaining the ends aimed at. Belief in the common man is no better founded than was belief in the supernatural gifts of kings, priests, and noblemen. Democracy guarantees a system of government in accordance with the wishes and plans of the majority, but it cannot prevent majorities from falling victim to erroneous ideas and from adopting inappropriate policies which not only fail to realise the ends aimed at, but result in disaster. Majorities too may err and destroy our civilization. The good cause will not triumph merely on account of its reasonableness and expediency. Only if men are such that they will finally espouse policies reasonable and likely to attain the ultimate ends aimed at, will civilization improve and society and state render men more satisfied, although not happy in a metaphysical sense. Whether or not this condition is given, only the unknowable future can reveal. There is no room within a system of praxeology for ameliorism and optimistic fatalism. Man is free in the sense that he must daily choose anew between policies that lead to success and those that lead to disaster, social disintegration, and barbarism. The term progress is nonsensical when applied to cosmic events or to a comprehensive worldview. We have no information about the plans of the prime mover, but it is different with its use in the frame of an ideological doctrine. The immense majority strives after a greater and better supply of food, clothes, homes, and other material amenities. In calling a rise in the masses' standard of living progress and improvement, economists do not espouse a mean materialism. They simply establish the fact that people are motivated by the urge to improve the material conditions of their existence. They judge policies from the point of view of the aims men want to attain. He who disdains the fall in infant mortality and the gradual disappearance of famines and plagues may cast the first stone upon the materialism of the economists. There is but one yardstick for the appraisal of human action, whether or not it is fit to attain the ends aimed at by acting men. Section 10. Exchange within society. Number 1. Artistic exchange and interpersonal exchange. Action always is essentially the exchange of one state of affairs for another state of affairs. If the action is performed by an individual without any reference to cooperation with other individuals, we may call it autistic exchange. An instant, the isolated hunter who kills an animal for his own consumption, he exchanges leisure and a cartridge for food. Within society, cooperation substitutes impersonal or social exchange for autistic exchanges. Man gives to other men in order to receive from them. Mutuality emerges. Man serves in order to be served. The exchange relation is the fundamental social relation. Interpersonal exchange of goods and services weaves the bond which unites men into society. The societal formula is do et des, where there is no unintentional mutuality. Where an action is performed without any design or being benefited by a concomitant action of other men, there is no interpersonal exchange, but autistic exchange. It does not matter whether artistic action is beneficial or detrimental to other people, or whether it does not concern him at all. A genius may perform his task for himself, not for the crowd. However, he is an outstanding benefactor of mankind. The robber kills his victim for his own advantage. The murdered man is by no means a partner in this crime, he is merely its object. What is done against him. Hostile aggression was a practice common to man's non-human forebears. Conscious and purposeful cooperation is the outcome of a long evolutionary process. Ethnology and history have provided us with interesting information concerning the beginning and the primitive patterns of interpersonal exchange. Some consider the custom of mutual giving and returning of presents and stipulating a certain return present in advance as a precursory pattern of interpersonal exchange. Others consider dumb barter as a primitive mode of trade. However, to make presents in the expectation of being rewarded by the receiver's return present, or in order to acquire the favour of a man whose animosity could be disastrous, is already tantamount to interpersonal exchange. The same applies to dumb barter, which is distinguished from other modes of bartering and trading only through the absence of oral discussion. It is the essential characteristic of the categories of human action that they are apodictic and absolute and do not admit of any gradation. There is action or non-action. There is exchange or non-exchange. Everything which applies to action and exchange as such is given or not given in every individual instance according to whether there is or is not action and exchange. In the same way, the boundaries between autistic exchange and interpersonal exchange are sharply distinct. Making one-sided presents without the aim of being rewarded by any conduct on the part of the receiver or of the third persons is autistic exchange. The donor acquires the satisfaction which the better condition of the receiver gives to him. The receiver gets the present as a God-sent gift. But if the presents are given in order to influence some people's conduct, they are no longer one-sided, but a variety of interpersonal exchange between the donor and the man whose conduct they are designed to influence. Although the emergence of interpersonal exchange was the result of a long evolution, no gradual transition is conceivable between autistic and interpersonal exchange. There was no intermediary modes of exchange between them. The step leads from autistic to interpersonal exchange was no less a jump into something entirely new and essentially different than was the step from automatic reaction of the cells and nervous to conscious and purposeful behaviour to action. Number 2. Contractual bonds and hegemonic bonds. There are two different kinds of social cooperation. Cooperation by virtue of contract and coordination, and cooperation by virtue of command and subordination or hegemony. Where and as far as cooperation is based on contract, the logical relation between the cooperating individuals is symmetrical. They are all parties to interpersonal exchange contracts. John has the same relation to Tom as Tom has to John. Where and as far as cooperation is based on command and subordination, there is the man who commands and those who obey his orders. The logical relation between these two classes of men is asymmetrical. There is a director and there are the people under his care. The director alone chooses and directs. The others, the wards, are mere pawns in his actions. The power that calls into life and animates any social body is always ideological might. And the fact that makes an individual a member of any social compound is always his own conduct. This is no less valid with regard to a hegemonic societal bond. It is true, people are as a rule born into the most important hegemonic bonds, into the family and into the state, and this was also the case with the hegemonic bonds of older days, slavery and serfdom, which disappeared in the realm of Western civilization. But no physical violence and compulsion could possibly force a man against his will to remain in the status of the ward of a hegemonic order. What violence or the threat of violence brings about is a state of affairs in which subjection as a rule is considered more desirable than rebellion. Faced with the choice between the consequences of obedience and of disobedience, the ward prefers the former and thus integrates himself into the hegemonic bond. Every new command places this choice before him again, and yielding again and again, he himself contributes his share to the continuous existence of the hegemonic societal bond. Even as a ward in such a system, he is an acting human being, i.e., a being not simply yielding to blind impulses, but using his reasoning and choosing between alternatives. What differentiates the hegemonic bond from the contractual bond is the scope in which the choices of the individuals determine the course of events. As soon as a man has decided in favour of his subjection to a hegemonic system, he becomes within the margin of the system's activities and for the time of his subjection a pawn of the director's actions. Within the hegemonic societal body, and as far as it directs its subordinates' conduct, only the director acts. The wards act only in choosing subordination. Having once chosen subordination, they no longer act for themselves. They are taken care of. In the frame of a contractual society, the individual members exchange definite quantities of goods and services for a definite quality. In choosing subjection in a hegemonic body, a man neither gives nor receives anything that is definite. He integrates himself into a system which he has to render indefinite services and will receive what the director is willing to assign to him. He is at the mercy of the director. The director alone is free to choose. Whether the director is an individual or an organised group of individuals, a directorate, and whether the director is a selfish maniacal tyrant or a benevolent paternal despot is of no relevance for the structure of the whole system. The distinction between these two kinds of social cooperation is common to all theories of society. Ferguson described it as the contrast between warlike nations and commercial nations. St. Simon is the contrast between pugnacious nations and peaceful or industrial nations. Herbert Spencer is the contrast between societies of individual freedom and those of a military structure. Sombart as the contrast between heroes and peddlers. The Marxians distinguish between the Gentile organisation of a fabulous state of primitive society and the eternal bliss of socialism on the one hand and the unspeakable degradation of capitalism on the other hand. The Nazi philosophers distinguish the counterfeit system of bourgeois security from the heroic system of authoritarian Führertum. The valuation of both systems is different with the various sociologists, but they fully agree in the establishment of the contrast and no less, and recognising that no third principle is thinkable and feasible. Western civilization, as well as the civilization of the more advanced Eastern peoples, are achievements of men who have cooperated according to the pattern of contractual coordination. These civilizations, it is true, have adopted in some respects bonds of hegemonic structure. State as an apparatus of compulsion and coercion is by necessity a hegemonic organization. So is the family and its household community. However, the characteristic feature of these civilizations is the contractual structure proper to the cooperation of the individual families. There once prevailed almost complete autarky and economic isolation of the individual household units. When interfamilial exchange of goods and services was interfamilial exchange of goods and services was substituted for each family's economic self-sufficiency. It was, in all nations, commonly considered civilized, a cooperation based on contract. When interfamilial exchange of goods and services, sorry, I've gone bloody read that line. Human civilization, as it has been hitherto known to historical experience, is preponderantly a product of contractual relations. Any kind of human cooperation and social mutuality is essentially an order of peace and conciliatory settlement of disputes. In the domestic relations of any societal unit, be it a contractual or a hegemonic bond, there must be peace. Whether there are violent conflicts, as far as there are such conflicts, there is neither cooperation nor societal bonds. Those political parties which, in their eagerness to substitute the hegemonic system for the contractual system, point at the rottenness of peace and of bourgeois society, extol the moral nobility of violence and bloodshed, and praise war and revolution as the eminently natural methods of interhuman relations, contradict themselves. For their own utopias are designed as realms of peace. The Reich of the Nazis and the Commonwealth of the Marxians are planned as societies of undisturbed peace. They are too created by pacification, i.e., the violent subjection of all those not ready to yield without resistance. In a contractual world, various states can quietly coexist. In a hegemonic world, there can be only one Reich or Commonwealth and only one director. Socialism must choose between a renunciation of the advantages of division of labour encompassing the whole earth and all the peoples and establishment of a world-embracing hegemonic order. It is this fact that made Russian Bolshevism, German Nazism, and Italian fascism dynamic, i.e., aggressive. Under contractual conditions, empires are dissolved into a loose league of autonomous member nations. The hegemonic state is bound to strive after the annexation of all independent states. The contractual order of society is an order of right and law. It is a government under the rule of law, Rechtsstaat, as differentiated from the welfare state, Wohlfahrtsstaat, or paternal state. Right or law is the complex of rules determining the orbit in which individuals are free to act. No such orbit is left towards a hegemonic society. In the hegemonic state, there is neither right nor law. There are only directives and regulations which the director may change daily and apply with what discrimination he pleases, and which the wards must obey. The wards have one freedom only, to obey without asking questions. Number 3. Calculative action. All the praxeological categories are eternal and unchangeable as they are uniquely determined by the logical structure of the human mind and by the natural conditions of man's existence. Both in acting and in theorizing about acting, man can neither free himself from these categories nor go beyond them. A kind of acting categorically different from that determined by these categories is neither possible nor conceivable for man. Man can never comprehend something which can neither be action nor non-action. There is no history of acting. There is no evolution which would lead from non-action to action. There are no transitory stages between action and non-action. There is only acting and non-acting. And for every concrete action, all that is rigorously valid, which is categorically established with regard to action in general. Every action can make use of ordinal numbers. For the application of cardinal numbers and for the arithmetical computation based on them, special conditions are required. These conditions emerged in the historical evolution of the contractual society. Thus, the way was open for computation and calculation in the planning of future action and in establishing the effects achieved by past action. Cardinal numbers and their use in arithmetical operations are also eternal and immutable categories of the human mind, but their applicability to predetermination or premeditation and the recording of action depends upon certain conditions which were not given in the early state of human affairs, which only appeared later, and which could possibly disappear again. It was cognition of what is going on within a world in which action is computable and calculable that led men to elaboration of the sciences of praxeology and economics. Economics is essentially a theory of that scope of action in which calculation is applied or can be applied if certain conditions are realized. No other distinction is of greater significance, both for human life and for the study of human action, than that between calculable action and non-calculable action. Modern civilization is above all characterized by the fact that it has elaborated a method which makes the use of arithmetic possible in a broad field of activities. This is what people have in mind when attributing to it the not very expedient and often misleading epithet of rationality. The mental grasp and analysis of the problems present in a calculating market system were the starting point of economic thinking, which finally led to general praxeological cognition. However, it is not the consideration of this historical fact that makes it necessary to start exposition of a comprehensive system of economics by analysis of the market economy and to place before this analysis an examination of the problem of economic calculation. Not historical nor heuristic aspects enjoin such a procedure, but the requirements of logical and systematic rigour. The problems concerned are apparent and practical only with the sphere of calculating market economy. It is only a hypothetical and figurative transfer which makes them utilisable for the scrutiny of other systems of society's economic organisation which do not allow any calculation. Economic calculation is the fundamental issue in the comprehension of all problems commonly called economic. Part 3, Economic Calculation, Section 11, Valuation without Calculation, Number 1, the Graduation of Means. Acting man transfers the valuation of ends he aims at to the means. Other things being equal, he assigns to the total amount of the various means the same value he attaches to the end which they are fit to bring about. For the moment, we may disregard the time needed for the production of the end and its influence upon the relation between the valuation of the ends and that of the means. The gradation of the means is like that of the ends, a process of preferring A to B. It is preferring and setting aside. It is manifestation of a judgment that A is more intensely desired than is B. It opens a field for application of ordinal numbers, but it is not open to application of cardinal numbers and arithmetical operations based on them. If somebody gives me the choice among 3 tickets, entitling one to attend the operas Aida, Falstaff, and Traviata, I take, if I can, only take one of them, Aida, and if I can take more than one, Falstaff also. And I lost myself there. If somebody gives me the choice among 3 tickets entitling one to attend the operas Aida, Falstaff, and Traviata, and I take it, if I can, only take one of them, Aida, and if I can take one more, Falstaff also, if I have made a choice. That means, under given conditions, I prefer Aida and Falstaff to Traviata. If I could only choose one of them, I would prefer Aida to renounce Falstaff. If I called the admission to Aida A, and that to Falstaff B, and that to Traviata C, I can say I prefer A to B and B to C. The immediate goal of acting is frequently the acquisition of countable and measurable supplies of tangible things. Then, acting man has to choose between countable quantities. He prefers, for example, 15R to 7p, but if he had to choose between 15R and 8p, he might prefer 8p. We can express this state of affairs by declaring that he values 15R less than 8p, but higher than 7p. This is tantamount to the statement that he prefers A to B and B to C, the substitution of 8p for A, of 15r for B, and of 7p for C. Changes neither the meaning of the statement nor the fact that it describes. It certainly does not render reckoning with cardinal numbers possible. It does not open a field for economic calculation and the mental operation based upon such calculation. Number 2. The barter fiction of the elementary theory of value and prices. The elaboration of economic theory is heuristically dependent upon the logical process of reckoning to such an extent that economists fail to realize the fundamental problem involved in the methods of economic calculation. They were prone to take economic calculation as a matter of course. They do not see that it is not an ultimate given, but a derivative, requiring reduction to more elementary phenomena. They misconstrued economic calculation. They took for a category of human action, ignored the fact that it is only a category inherent in acting under special conditions. They were fully aware of the fact that interpersonal exchange and consequently market exchange affected by the intermediary of a common medium of exchange, money, and therefore prices are special features of a certain state of society's economic organization which did not exist in the primitive civilizations and could possibly disappear in the further course of historical change. But they did not comprehend that money prices are only a vehicle of economic calculation. Thus, most of their studies are of little use. Even the writings of the most eminent economists are vitiated to some extent by the fallacies implied in their ideas about economic calculation. The modern theory of value and prices shows how the choices of individuals, their preferring of some things and setting aside of other things, result in the sphere of interpersonal exchange and the emergence of market prices. These masterful expositions are unsatisfactory in some minor points and disfigured by untenable expressions, but they are essentially irrefutable. As far as they need to be amended, it must be done by a consistent elaboration of the fundamental thoughts of their authors rather than by a refutation of their reasoning. In order to trace back the phenomena of the market to the universal category of preferring A to B, the elementary theory of values and prices is bound to use some imaginary constructions. The use of imaginary constructions to which nothing corresponds in reality is an indispensable tool of thinking. No other method would have contributed anything to the interpretation of reality, but one of the most important problems of science is to avoid the fallacies which ill-considered employment of such constructions can entail. The elementary theory of value and prices employs, apart from other imaginary constructions to be dealt with later, the construction of a market in which all transactions are performed in direct exchange. There is no money, goods and services are directly bartered against other goods and services. This imaginary construction is necessary. One must disregard the intermediary role played by money in order to realize what is ultimately exchanged and is always economic goods of the first order against other such goods. Money is nothing but a medium of interpersonal exchange, but one must carefully guard oneself against the delusions which this construction of a market with direct exchange can easily engender. A serious blunder that owes its origins and its tenacity to a misinterpretation of this imaginary construction was the assumption that the medium of exchange is a neutral factor only. According to this opinion, the only difference between direct and indirect exchange was I'm in the right place. According to this opinion, the only difference between direct and indirect exchange was that only in the latter was a medium of exchange used. The interpolation of money into the transaction, it was asserted, did not affect the main features of the business. One did not ignore the fact that in the course of history tremendous alterations in the purchasing power of money have occurred, and that these fluctuations often convulsed the whole system of the exchange. But it was believed that such events were exceptional facts caused by inappropriate policies. Only bad money can bring about such disarrangements. In addition, people misunderstood the causes and effects of these disturbances. They tacitly assumed that its changes in purchasing power occur with regard to all goods and services at the same time and to the same extent. This is, of course, what the fable of money's neutrality implies. The whole theory of catalactics, it was held, can be elaborated under the assumption that there is direct exchange only. If this is once achieved, the only thing to be added is the simple insertion of money terms into the complex of theorems concerning direct exchange. However, this final completion of the catalactic system was considered of minor importance only. It was not believed that it could alter anything essential in the structure of economic teachings. The main task of economics was the study of direct exchange. What remained to be done besides this was at best only a scrutiny of the problems of bad money. Complying with this opinion, economists neglected to lay due stress upon the problems of indirect exchange. Their treatment of monetary problems was superficial. It was only loosely connected with the main body of scrutiny of their market process. About the turn of the 19th and 20th century, the problems of indirect exchange were by and large relegated to a subordinate place. There were treatises on catalactics which dealt only incidentally and curiously with monetary matters, and there were books on currency and banking which did not even attempt to integrate their subject into the structure of a catalactic system. At the universities of the Anglo-Saxon countries, there were separate chairs for economics and for currency and banking, and at most of the German universities, monetary problems were almost entirely disregarded. Only later economists realised that some of the most important and most intricate problems of catalactics are to be found in the field of indirect exchange, and that an economic theory which does not pay full regard to them is lamentably defective. The coming into vogue of investigations concerning the relation between the natural rate of interest and the money rate of interest, the ascendancy of the monetary theory of the trade cycle, and the entire demolition of the purchasing power of money the entire demolition of the doctrine of the simultaneousness and evenness of the changes in the purchasing power of money were marks of the new tenor of economic thought. Of course, these new ideas were essentially a continuation of the work gloriously begun by David Hume, the British Currency School, John Stuart Mill, and Cairns. Still more detrimental was a second error which emerged from the careless use of the imaginary construction of a market with direct exchange. An invertebrate fallacy asserted that things and services exchanged are of equal value. Value was considered as objective, as an intrinsic quality inherent in things and not merely as the expression of various people's eagerness to acquire them. People, it was assumed, first established the magnitude of value proper to goods and services by an active measurement and then proceeded to barter them against quantities of goods and services of the same amount of value. This fallacy frustrated Aristotle's approach to economic problems, and for almost 2,000 years the reasoning of all of those for whom Aristotle's opinions were authoritative it seriously vitiated the marvellous achievements of the classical economists and rendered the writings of their epigones, especially those of Marx and the Marxian school, entirely futile. The basis of modern economics is the cognition that it is precisely the disparity in their value attached to the objects exchanged that results in their being exchanged. People buy and sell only because they appraise the things given up less than those received. Thus, the notion of a measurement of value is vain. An active exchange is neither preceded nor accompanied by any process which could be called a measuring of value. An individual may attach the same value to two things, but then no exchange can result. But if there is a diversity in valuation, all that can be asserted with regard to it is that 1A is valued higher than what is preferred to 1B. Values and valuations are intensive quantities and not extensive quantities. They are not susceptible to mental grasp by the application of cardinal numbers. However, the spurious idea that values are measurable and are really measured in the conduct of economic transactions was so deeply rooted that even eminent economists fell victim to the fallacy implied. Even Friedrich von Wieser and Irving Fisher took it for granted that there must be something like measurement of value, and that economics must be able to indicate and explain the methods by which such measurement is effected. Most of the lesser economists simply maintain that money serves as a measure of value. Now, we must realize that valuing means to prefer A to B. There is logically, epistemologically, psychologically, and praxeologically only one pattern of preferring. It does not matter whether a lover prefers one girl to other girls. A man. Sorry, let me get some water and I'll start that again. It does not matter whether a lover prefers one girl to other girls, a one-man friend to other people, an amateur one painting to other paintings, or a consumer a loaf of bread to a piece of candy. Preferring always means to love or to desire A more than B, just as there is no standard, no measurement of sexual love, of friendship and sympathy, and of aesthetic enjoyment, so there is no measurement of value of commodities. If a man exchanges £2 of butter for a shirt, all that we can assert with regard to this transaction is he, at that instant of the transaction and under the conditions which this instant offers to him, prefers one shirt to £2 of butter. It is certain that every act of preferring is characterized by a definite psychic intensity of the feelings it implies. There are grades in the intensity of the desire to attain a definite goal, and this intensity determines the psychic profit which the successful action brings to the acting individual. But psychic quantities can only be felt. They are entirely personal, and there is no semantic means to express their intensity and to convey information about them to other people. In the market society, there are money prices. Economic calculation is calculation in terms of money prices. The various quantities of goods and services enter into this calculation with the amount of money for which they are bought and sold in the market, or for which they could prospectively be bought and sold. It is a fictitious assumption that an isolated, self-sufficient individual or the general manager of a socialist system, i.e., a system in which there is no market for means of production, could calculate. There is no way which could lead from there is no way which could lead from the money computation of a market economy to any kind of computation in a non-market system. The theory of value in socialism. Socialists, institutionalists, and the historical school have blamed economists for having employed the imaginary construction of an isolated individual's thinking and acting. This Robinson Crusoe pattern, as asserted, is of no use for the study of the conditions of a market economy. The rebuke is somewhat justified. Imaginary constructions of an isolated individual and of a planned economy without market exchange become utilizable only through the implication of the fictitious assumption. Self-contradictory in thought and contrary to reality, the economic calculation is possible also within a system without a market for the means of production. It is certainly a serious blunder that economists do not become aware of this difference between the conditions of a market economy and a non-market economy. Yet, the socialists had little reason for criticising this fault, for it consisted precisely in the fact that the economists had tacitly implied the assumption that a socialist order of society could also resort to economic calculation, and that they asserted the possibility of the result of the realisation of the socialist plans. The classical economists and their epigones could not, of course, recognise the problems involved. If it were true that the value of things is determined by the quantity of labour required for their production or reproduction, then there is no further problem of economic calculation. The supporters of the labour theory of value cannot be blamed for having misconstructed the problems of a socialist system. Their fateful failure was the untenable doctrine of value. That some of them were ready to consider the imaginary construction of a socialist economy as a useful and realisable pattern for their thorough reform of social organisation did not contradict the essential content of their theoretical analysis. But it was different with subjective catalactics. It was unpardonable for the modern economist to have failed to recognise the problems involved. Weiser was right when he once declared that many economists have unwittingly dealt with the theory of value of communism and have, on that account, neglected to elaborate that of the present state of society. It is tragic that he himself did not avoid this failure. The illusion that a rational order of economic management is possible in a society based on public ownership of the means of production owed its origin to the value theory of the classical economists and its tenacity to the failure of many modern economists to think through consistently to its ultimate conclusion, the fundamental theorem of the subjectivist theory. Thus, the socialist utopias were generated and preserved by the shortcomings of the schools of thought which the Marxians reject as an ideological disguise of selfish class interest of the exploiting bourgeoisie. In truth, it was the errors of these schools that made the socialist ideas thrive. This fact clearly demonstrates the emptiness of the Marxian teachings concerning ideologies and its modern offshoot, the sociology of knowledge. Let me quickly check something. Sorry, allowing myself quickly to be distracted by catching up on things. Number 3, the problem of economic calculation. Acting man uses knowledge provided by the natural sciences for the elaboration of technology. The applied sciences of action possible in the field of external events, technology shows what could be achieved if one wanted to achieve it, and how it could be achieved provided people were prepared to employ the means indicated. With the progress of natural sciences, technology progressed too. Many would prefer to say that the desire to improve technological methods promoted the progress of the natural sciences. The quantification of the natural sciences made technology quantitative. Modern technology is essentially the applied art of quantitative prediction of the outcome of possible action. One calculates with a reasonable degree of precision the outcome of planned actions, and one calculates in order to arrange an action in such a way that a definite result emerges. However, the mere information conveyed by technology would suffice for the performance of calculation only if all means of production, both material and human, could be perfectly substituted for one another according to definite ratios, or if they were all absolutely specific. In the former case, all means of production would be fit, although according to different ratios, for the attainment of all ends whatever. Things would be as if only one kind of means, one kind of economic goods of a higher order existed. In the latter case, each means could be employed for the attainment of one end only. One would attach to each group of complementary factors of production the value attached to the respective good of the first order. Here again, we disregard provisionally the modifications brought about at the time factor. Neither of these two conditions is present in the universe in which man acts. The means can only be substituted for one another within narrow limits. They are, more or less, specific means for the attainment of various ends. But on the other hand, most means are not absolutely specific, but on the other hand, most means are not absolutely specific. Most of them are fit for various purposes. The fact that there are different classes of means, most of the means are better suited for the realization of some ends, less suited for the attainment of some other ends, and absolutely useless for the production of a third group of ends, and that therefore, the various means allows for the various uses, set man the task of allocating them to employments in which they can render the best service. I would just say, if my voice is getting to the point whereby this is unbearable to listen to, just tell me in chat. Here, computation in kind as applied by technology is of no avail. Technology operates with countable and immeasurable quantities of external things and effects. It knows causal relations between them, but it is foreign to their relevance to human wants and desires. Its field is that of objective use only. It judges all problems from the disinterested point of view of a neutral observer of physical, chemical, and biological events. For the notion of subjective use value, for the specifically human angle, and for the dilemmas of acting man, there is no room in the teachings of technology. It ignores the economic problem to employ the available means in which a way that no more urgently felt should remain unsatisfied, because the means suitable for its attainment were employed wasted for the means suitable, employed wasted for the attainment of a want less urgently felt. For the solution of such problems, technology and its methods of counting and measuring are unfit. Technology tells us how a given end could be attained by the employment of various means which can be used together in various combinations, or how various available means could be employed for the certain purposes. But it is a loss to tell man which procedures he should choose out of the infinite variety of imaginable and possible modes of production. What acting man wants to know is how he must employ the available means for the best possible and the most economic removal of felt uneasiness. But technology provides him with nothing more than statements about causal relations between external things. It tells, for example, 7a and 3b plus 5c plus blah blah blah, blah xn are liable to bring about 8p. But although it knows the value attached by acting man to the various goods of the first order, it cannot decide whether this precept or any other out of the infinite multitude of similarly constructed precepts best serves the attainment of the ends sought by acting man. The art of engineering can establish how a bridge must be built in order to span a river at a given point and to carry definite loads, but it cannot answer the question whether or not the construction of such a bridge would withdraw the material factors of production and labour from an employment in which they could satisfy needs more urgently felt. It cannot tell whether or not the bridge should be built at all, where it should be built, what capacity for bearing burdens it should have, and which of the many possibilities for its construction should be chosen. Technological computation can establish relations between various classes of means only to the extent that they can be substituted for one another in an attempt to attain a definite goal. But action is bound to discover relations among all means, however dissimilar they may be, without any regard to the question of whether or not they can replace one another in performing the same services. Give me 2 seconds. Technology and the considerations derived from it would be of little use for acting man if it were impossible to introduce into the schemes the money prices of goods and services. The projects and designs of engineers would be purely academic if they could not compare input and output on a common basis. The lofty theorist in the seclusion of his laboratory does not bother about such trifling things. What he is searching for is causal relations between various elements of the universe. But the practical man, eager to improve human conditions by removing uneasiness as far as possible, must know whether under given conditions what he is planning is the best method, or even a method to make people less uneasy. He must know whether what he wants to achieve will be an improvement when compared with the present state of affairs and with the advantages to be expected from the execution of other technically realizable projects which cannot be put into execution if the project he has in mind absorbs the available means. Such comparisons can only be made by the use of money prices. Thus, money becomes the vehicle of economic calculation. This is not a separate function of money. Money is a universally used medium of exchange, nothing else. Only because money is the common medium of exchange, because most goods and services can be sold and bought on the market against money, and only as far as this is the case, can men use money prices in reckoning. The exchange ratios between money and the various goods and services as established on the market of the past and as expected to be established on the market of the future are the mental tools of economic planning. Where there are no money prices, there are no such things as economic quantities. There are only various quantitative relations between various causes and effects in the external world. There is no means for man to find out what kind of action would best serve his endeavours to remove uneasiness as far as possible. There is no need to dwell upon the primitive conditions of the household economy of self-sufficient farmers. These people performed only very simple processes of production. For them, no calculation was needed, as they could directly compare input and output. If they wanted shirts, they grew hemp. They spun, wove, and sewed. They could, without any calculation, easily make up their minds whether or not the toil and trouble expended were compensated by the product. But for civilized mankind, a return to such a life is out of the question. Number 4. Economic calculation in the market. The quantitative treatment of economic problems must not be confused with the quantitative methods applied in dealing with the problems of external universe of physical and chemical events. The distinctive mark of economic calculation is that it is neither based upon nor related to anything which could be characterized as measurement. A process of measurement consists in the establishment of the numerical A process of measurement consists in the establishment of the numerical relation of an object with regard to another object, vis-a-vis the unit of measurement. The ultimate source of measurement is that of spatial dimensions. With the aid of the unit defined in reference to extension, one measures energy and potentiality, the power of a thing to bring about changes in other things and relations in the passing of time. A pointer reading is directly indicative of a spatial relation and only indirectly of other quantities. The assumption underlying measurement is the immutability of the unit. The unit of length is the rock upon which all measurement is based. It is assumed that man cannot help considering it immutable. The last decades have witnessed a revolution in the traditional epistemological settings of physics, chemistry, and mathematics. We are on the eve of innovations whose scope cannot be foreseen. It may be that the coming generations of physicists will have to face problems in some way similar to those with which praxeology must deal. Perhaps they will be forced to drop the idea that there is something unaffected by cosmic changes which the observer can use as a standard of measurement. But however that may come, the logical structure of measurement of earthly entities as the macroscopic or molar field of physics will not alter. Measurement in the orbit of microscopic physics too is made with meter scales, micrometers, spectrographs, ultimately the gross sense organs of man, the observer and experimenter who himself is molar. It cannot free itself from Euclidean geometry and from the notion of an unchangeable standard. There are monetary units and there are measurable physical units of various economic goods and of many, but not of all, services bought and sold. But the exchange ratios which we have to deal with are permanently fluctuating. There is nothing constant and variable in them. They defy any attempt to measure them. They are not facts in the sense which a physicist calls the establishment of the weight of a quantity of a copper a fact. They are historical events expressive of what happened once at a definite instance and under definite circumstances. The same numerical exchange ratio may appear again, but it is by no means certain whether this will really happen, and if it happens, the question is open to whether this identical result was the outcome of the preservation of the same circumstances, or of a return to them, rather than the outcome of the interplay of a very different constellation of price-determining factors. Numbers applied by acting man in economic calculation do not refer to quantities measured, but to exchange ratios as they are expected, on the basis of understanding, to be realized on the markets of the future, to which alone all acting is directed and which alone accounts for the acting man. We are not dealing at this point with our investigation with the problem of a quantitative science of economics, but with the analysis of the mental processes performed by acting men and applying quantitative distinctions when planning conduct. As action is always directed towards influencing a state of affairs, economic calculation always deals with the future, as far as it takes past events and exchange ratios of the past into consideration. It does so only for the sake of an arrangement of future action. The task which acting man wants to achieve by economic calculation is to establish the outcome of acting by contrasting input and output. Economic calculation is neither an estimate of the expected outcome of future action or the establishment of the outcome of past action, but the latter does not serve merely historical and didactic aims. Its practical meaning is to show how much one is free to consume without impairing the future capacity to produce. It is with regard to this problem that the fundamental notions of economic calculation, capital and income, profit and loss, spending and saving, cost and yield are developed. The practical employment of these notions and of all notions derived from them is inseparably linked with the operation of a market in which goods and services of all orders are exchanged against the universally used medium of exchange, vis-a-vis money. They would be merely academic, without any relevance for acting man within a world with a different structure of action. Section 12. The sphere of economic calculation. Number 1. The character of monetary entries. Economic calculation can comprehend everything that is exchanged against money. The prices of goods and services are either historical data describing past events or anticipations of probable future events. Information about a past price conveys the knowledge that one or several acts of interpersonal exchange were effected according to this ratio. It does not convey directly any knowledge about future prices. We may often assume that the market conditions which determine the formations of prices in the recent past will not change at all, or at least not change considerably in the immediate future, so that prices too will remain unchanged or changed only slightly. Such expectations are reasonable if the price is concerned with the results of the interaction of many people ready to buy or sell, provided the exchange ratios seemed propitious to them, and if the market situation was not influenced by conditions which are considered as accidental, extraordinary, and not likely to return. However, the main task of economic calculation is not to deal with the problem of unchanging or only slightly changing market situations and prices, but to deal with the change. The acting individual either anticipates changes which will occur without his own interference and wants to adjust his action to this anticipated set of affairs, or he wants to embark upon a project which will change conditions even if no other factors produce a change. The prices for the past are for him merely starting points in his endeavours to anticipate future prices. Historians and statisticians content themselves with prices of the past. Practical man looks at the prices of the future, be it only the immediate future of the next hour, day, or month. For him, the prices of the past are merely a help in anticipating future prices, not only in his preliminary calculation of the expected outcome of planned action, but no less in his attempts to establish the result of his past transactions. He is primarily concerned with future prices. In balance sheets and in profit-loss statements, the result of the past action becomes visible as the differences between the money equivalent of funds owed. Total assets minus total liabilities at the beginning and the end of the period reported, and as the difference between the money equivalent of costs incurred and the goods proceed earned. In such statements, it is necessary to enter the estimated money equivalent of all assets and abilities other than cash. These items should be appraised according to the prices at which they could probably be sold in the future, or, as especially the case with equipment for production processes, in reference to the prices to be expected in the sale of merchandise manufactured with their aid. However, old business customs and the provisions of commercial law and of the tax laws have brought about a division from sound principles of accounting which merely aim at the best attainable degrees of correctness. These customs and laws are not so much concerned with correctness in balance sheets and profit and loss statements as with the pursuit of other aims. Commercial legislation aims at a method of accounting which could indirectly protect creditors against loss. It tends more or less to an appraisal of assets below their estimated market value in order to make the net profit and the total funds owed appear smaller than they really are. Oh, pardon me. The total funds appear smaller than they really are. Thus, A safety margin is created which reduces the danger that, to the prejudice of creditors, too much might be withdrawn from the firm as alleged profit than that already insolvent firm which might go until it had exhausted the means available for the satisfaction of its creditors. Contrariwise, I thought it was contrariwise, tax laws appear higher than an unbiased. Oh, sorry, I'm all over the place here. Safety margins created which reduces the danger that, to the prejudice of creditors, too much might be withdrawn from the firm as alleged profit, and that an already insolvent firm might go on until it exhausted the means available for the satisfaction of its creditors. Contrariwise, tax laws often tend toward a method of computation which makes earnings appear higher than an unbiased method would. The idea is to raise effective tax rates without making the raise visible on the nominal tax rate schedules. We must therefore distinguish between economic calculation as it is practiced by businessmen planning future transactions and the computation of business facts which serve other purposes. The determination of taxes due and economic calculations are different things. If a law imposing a tax upon the keeping of domestic servants prescribes that one male servant should be counted as two female servants, nobody would interpret such a provision as anything other than a method for determining the amount of tax due. Likewise, if an inheritance tax law prescribes that securities should be appraised at the stock's market quotation on the day of the descendant's death, we are merely provided with a way of determining the amount of tax. The duly kept accounts and a system of correct bookkeeping are accurate as to dollars and cents. They display an impressive precision, and the numerical exactitude of the items seems to remove all doubts. In fact, the most important figures they contain are speculative anticipations of future market constellations. It is a mistake to compare the items of any commercial account to the items used in purely technological reckoning, e.g., in a design for the construction of a machine. The engineer, as far as he attends to the technological side of his job, applies only numerical relations established by the methods of the experimental natural sciences. The businessman cannot avoid numerical terms which are the outcomes of his understanding of future human conduct. The main thing in balance sheets and in profit and loss statements is the evaluation of assets and liabilities not embodied in cash. All such balances are statements and virtually interim balances and interim statements. They describe as well as possible the state of affairs at an arbitrarily chosen instant while life and action go on and do not stop. It is possible to wind up individual business units, but the whole system of social production never ceases. Nor are the assets and liabilities consisting in cash exempt from the Nor are the assets and liabilities consisting in cash exempt from the interdeterminacy inherent in all business accounting items. They depend on the future constellation of the market no less than any item of inventory or equipment. The numerical exactitude of business accounts and calculations must not prevent us from realizing the uncertainty and speculative character of their items and of all computations based on them. Yet these facts do not detract from the efficiency of economic calculation. Economic calculation is as efficient as it can be. No reform could add to its efficiency. It renders? What am I going on about there? It renders to acting man all the services which he can obtain from numerical computation. It is, of course, not a means of knowing future conditions with certainty, and it does not deprive action of its speculative character. But this can be considered a deficiency only by those who do not come to recognize the facts that life is not rigid, that all things are perpetually fluctuating, and that men have no certain knowledge about the future. It is not the task of economic calculation to expand man's information about these conditions. It is the task to adjust his actions as well as possible to the present opinion concerning want satisfaction in the future. For this purpose, acting man needs a method of computation, and computation requires a common denominator to which all items are entered to be referable. The common common denominator of economic calculation is money. How long is this next section? I might go through a few more headings and then call it a day there, because I seem to be slipping up quite a bit and my voice is getting very not good. There is only so much that can be done by conditioning my throat with water. See, there's a real issue. There's an impressive vocal stamina, but it's by no means the way I would like to sound. Let's put it that way. 2. The limit of economic calculation. Economic calculation cannot comprehend things which are not sold and bought against money. Things are things which are not for there are things which are not for sale and for whose acquisition sacrifices other than money and money's worth must be expended. He who wants to train himself for great achievements must employ many means, some of which may require expenditure of money. But the essential things to be devoted to such an endeavour are not purchasable. Honour, virtue, glory, and likewise vigour, health, and life itself play a role in action both as means and as ends, but they do not enter into economic calculation. There are things which cannot at all be evaluated in money, and there are other things which can be appraised in money only with regard to a fraction of the value assigned to them. The appraisal of an old building must disregard its artistic and historical eminence as far as these qualities are not a source of proceeds in any money or goods, money or goods vendible. What touches a man's heart only and does not induce other people to make sacrifices for its attainment remains outside the pale of economic calculation. However, all this does not in the least impair the usefulness of economic calculation. Those things which do not enter into the items of accountancy and calculation are either ends or goods, or of the first order. No calculation is required to acknowledge them fully, and to make them due allowances for them. All the acting man needs in order to make his choices to contrast them with the total amount of cost of their acquisition or preservation requires. Let us assume that a town council has decided between two water supply projects. One of them implies the demolition of a historical landmark, while the other, at the cost of an increase in money expenditure, spares the landmark. The fact that feelings which recommend the conservation of the monument cannot be estimated in a sum of money does not in any way impede the councilman's decision. The values that are not reflected in any monetary exchange ratio are, on the contrary, by this very fact lifted into a particular position which makes the decision rather easier. No complaint is less justified than the lamentation that the computation methods of the market do not comprehend things not vendible. Moral and atheistic values do not suffer any damage on account of this fact. Money prices, market transactions, and economic calculation based upon them hum for a few minutes after to cool down. I'm not really sure if that works. I tend to find that I get really, I will stop talking for 10-15 minutes once I'm done, and it just gets worse for half an hour, and about half an hour later it tends to sort of work back. However, but what I will do that I'm not done last week is I will not be doing 2 in a row, because I don't think that helped me on Thursday. So I'm going to be doing this week, today, Wednesday, and Friday. And any ones in future after that will become a further question. Loquacious sermonizers disparage Western civilization as a mean system of mongering and peddling. Complacency, self-righteousness, and hypocrisy exult in scorning the dollar philosophy of our age. Neurotic reformers, mentally unbalanced literati, and ambitious demagogues take pleasure in indicting rationally and in preaching the gospel of the irrational. In the eyes of these babblers, money and calculation are the source of the most serious evils. However, the fact that men have developed a method of ascertaining as far as possible the expediency of their actions and of removing uneasiness in the most practical and economic way does not prevent anybody from arranging his conduct according to the principle he considers to be right. The materialism of the stock exchange and of business accountancy does not hinder anybody from living up to the standards of Thomas A. Kempis, or from dying for a noble cause. The fact that the masses prefer detective stories to poetry, and that it therefore pays better to write the former than the latter, is not caused by the use of money and monetary accounting. It is not the fault of money that there are gangsters, thieves, murderers, prostitutes, corruptible officials, and and judges. It is not true that honesty does not pay. It pays for those who prefer fidelity to what they consider to be right to the advantages which they derive from a different attitude. Other critics of economic calculation fail to realise that it is a method available only to people acting in the economic system of division of labour in a social order based upon private ownership of the means of production. It can only serve the considerations of individuals or groups of individuals operating in the institutional setting of this social order. It is consequently a calculation of private profits and not of social welfare. This means that prices of the market are the ultimate fact for economic calculation. It cannot be applied for considerations whose standard is not demanded of the consumers as manifested on the market by the hypothetical valuations of a dictatorial body managing all national or earthly affairs. He who seeks to judge actions from the point of view of a pretended social value, i.e., from the point of view of the whole society, and to criticise them by comparison with the events in an imaginary socialist system in which his own will is supreme, he has no use for economic calculation. Economic calculation in terms of money prices is the calculation of entrepreneurs producing for the consumers of a market society. It is no avail for other tasks. He who wants to employ economic he who wants to imply economic calculation must not look at affairs in the manner of a despotic mind. Prices can be used for calculation by the entrepreneurs, capitalists, landowners, and wage earners of a capitalistic society. For matters beyond the pursuits of these categories, it is inadequate. It is nonsensical to evaluate money objects which are not negotiated on the market and to employ in calculations arbitrary items which did not refer to reality. The law determines the amount to which ought to be paid an indemnification for having caused a man's death. But the prescription enacted for the determination of the amends due does not mean that there is a price for human life. Where there is slavery, there are market prices of slaves. Where there is no slavery, man, human life, and health are res extra commercium. Or commercium, yes. In a society of free men, the preservation of life and health are not ends, they do not enter into any processing of accounting means. It is possible to determine, in terms of money prices, the prices sum of, or the. It is possible to determine in terms of money prices the sum of the income or the wealth of a number of people. But it is nonsensical to reckon national income or national wealth. As soon as we embark upon considerations foreign to the reasoning of a man operating within the pale of a market economy, we are no longer helped by monetary calculations. The attempts to determine in money the wealth of a nation or of the wealth of mankind are as childish as the mystic efforts to solve the riddles of the universe by worrying about the dimensions of the pyramid of Cheops. If a business calculation values a supply of potatoes at $100, the idea that it will be possible to sell it or replace it against the sum if an entrepreneurial unit is estimated at $1 million, it means that one expects to sell for this amount. But what is the meaning of the items in a statement of a nation's total wealth? What is the meaning of the computation's final result? What must be entered into and what is to be left outside? Is it correct or not to enclose the value of the country's climate and the people's innate abilities and acquired skill? The businessman can convert his property into money, but the nation cannot. The money equivalents as used in acting and in economic calculation are money prices, i.e., the exchange ratios between money and other goods and services. The prices are not measured in money, they consist in money. Prices are either prices of the past or expected prices of the future. A price is necessarily a historical fact either of the past or of the future. There is nothing in prices which permits one to liken them to the measurement of physical and chemical phenomena. yeah, I think, well, for the betterment of my own health, I think I'm going to call it there today, because I can already feel things are starting to get rather tired. But for those people who have somehow turned up over 3 hours and 20 minutes into this stream, I'm doing this with the purpose of fundraising so that I can. Yeah, I'm engaging a sort of a fundraising project, or whatever you want to call it, so that I can attend the Mises Institute later this year. So if you would like to give to the fund or share the fund, which both are just as important as one another, the link for it is posted both in the description and in the live chat, and I'm sure we'll make it into the pinned comments when the stream is up. What are you saying in chat there? Fat girth. Surely all these abstract financial instruments end with a collapse in societal concepts of value. Interesting you might say that. I'll let Mises answer those questions as I continue on. And for those who have chosen to listen through to these either in full live or chipping way back through them, thank you very much for doing so. You know, not just with other things on this channel, but, you know, specifically this fundraiser and some of the other things that myself and Scrump are currently doing and will continue to do are only possible the fact that people take an interest in them, engage with them and share them. Whether that's an engagement in agreement or disagreement, I welcome both. So I shall bid you all farewell for just now and see you 1 p.m. on Monday, or not Monday, sorry, Wednesday, where I can hopefully continue to 5 o'clock. We shall see then. Goodbye.